They say every empire has a throne, and every throne has a man willing to bleed for it. But no one ever tells you what happens when that man stops bleeding. When the wounds calcify into something darker than ambition, something quieter than rage. The night Cedric Blackthorne walked into the royal winter ball, 300 aristocrats held their breath, not out of admiration, out of the primal, marrow-deep understanding that a predator had entered the room, and none of them, not a single silk-draped, champagne-drunk soul, was safe. This is the story of how that predator met the only creature he could never devour. The ballroom of Kensington Palace smelled like dying roses and old money. Thousands of candles bled golden light across vaulted ceilings where painted angels stared down with hollow, indifferent eyes, witnesses to centuries of lies told in evening dress. Crystal chandeliers swayed almost imperceptibly, as though the building itself breathed with the weight of the bodies packed inside it. The orchestra played Strauss, but the melody drowned beneath the real music of the evening. Whispered alliances, muffled threats, laughter that meant nothing, and silences that meant everything. Violet Ashcombe stood at the far edge of the room, close enough to the servants' corridor that she could smell bread baking somewhere deep in the palace kitchens. The scent was the only honest thing in the building. She pressed her back against a marble column and watched the crowd the way a sparrow watches hawks, not with fear exactly, but with the exhausting vigilance of something that knows it does not belong in the sky. Her gown was borrowed, pale blue silk that had been her mother's before consumption took the woman 6 winters ago. The seamstress in their village had done what she could, reshaped the bodice, replaced the lace at the sleeves with something less yellowed. But fabric remembers its age the way skin remembers scars. Under the chandelier light, anyone with trained eyes could see the dress belonged to a different decade. And in a room full of people whose entire existence revolved around appearances, everyone had trained eyes. "You look like a governess who wandered into the wrong party." Violet turned. Charlotte Pemberton stood beside her, a glass of champagne already half empty in her gloved hand. Charlotte was 22, the daughter of a viscount with moderate wealth and immoderate opinions, and the closest thing Violet had to a friend in London society, which meant Charlotte tolerated her presence and occasionally shared gossip. "Thank you, Charlotte. That's exactly the confidence I needed tonight." "I'm serious, Vi. You should have let me lend you the green one. You're pretty enough to survive a bold color." "I didn't come here to be pretty." "Then why did you come?" Violet hesitated. The truth was ugly and simple. Her uncle, Edward Ashcombe, had demanded it. Since taking control of her father's estate after his death, Edward had been systematically dismantling what little remained of the Ashcombe name. Selling paintings, dismissing staff, letting the East Wing rot into the rain. But he kept Violet presentable, kept her fed and clothed just enough to trot her out at events like this one, because a young unmarried niece was currency. Not valuable currency, but currency nonetheless. "My uncle thinks someone might notice me," Violet said. Charlotte snorted. "Your uncle thinks someone might buy you. There's a difference." The words landed without softness, but Violet didn't flinch. She had stopped flinching at the truth about 2 years ago, around the same time she stopped expecting the world to be kind. Kindness was a luxury, and luxuries required money, and money was the one thing the Ashcombe family had bled out completely. "Lord Hargrove has been looking at you," Charlotte said, tilting her chin toward the dance floor. "Don't look now. Tall, blonde, red cravat. He's been watching you for 10 minutes. "I know." "You know, and you're hiding behind a column?" "I'm not hiding. I'm deciding." "Deciding what?" "Whether his attention is worth the cost." Charlotte raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had learned, in 3 seasons of knowing Violet, that the girl's quiet exterior housed a mind that moved faster and colder than her circumstances suggested. Poverty had not made Violet desperate. It had made her calculating, and that, Charlotte thought privately, was far more dangerous. Across the ballroom, Lord Sebastian Hargrove was indeed watching. He stood among a cluster of young nobles, 2nd and 3rd sons of earls, boys with enough money to be reckless and enough title to avoid consequences. Hargrove was 26, heir to a shipping fortune, and possessed the kind of good looks that women admired and men instinctively distrusted. His smile never reached his eyes. His compliments always carried a second edge. He moved through society the way a card sharp moves through a gambling hall, always winning, never honestly. He broke from his group and crossed the floor toward Violet with the practiced stride of a man who had never been told no. "Miss Ashcombe." He stopped 2 feet away, close enough to be intimate, far enough to appear proper. The geometry of aristocratic predation. You look lonely. I look alone, Violet corrected. There's a difference. Hargrove smiled. Is there? I've always found that people who insist on that distinction are usually the loneliest of all. And I've always found that men who approach women standing alone at parties rarely have charitable intentions. Charlotte made a small sound behind her champagne glass, half laugh, half warning, and drifted away with the instinct of someone who knew when a conversation was about to become a battlefield. Hargrove's smile didn't waver, but something behind it shifted, a tightening, the faintest crack in the porcelain. You're bold for a girl in a borrowed dress. Violet felt the blow land. Felt it the way you feel a slap. The sting first, the heat after. But she had been hit with worse. Edward's creditors knocking at dawn. The pitying glances of shopkeepers who knew her family name and its diminished meaning. The slow, grinding humiliation of watching everything her father built dissolve like sugar in rainwater. And you're cruel for a man trying to be charming, she said. I wasn't trying to be charming. I was trying to be honest. Then congratulations. You've succeeded at something unattractive. Hargrove stepped closer. The geometry collapsed. His voice dropped to the register menus when they want to remind women that physical space is a negotiation, they will always win. You should be more careful, Miss Ashcombe. Your family name doesn't carry the weight it used to. And a girl without a name, without money, without a single powerful friend in this room should learn to smile when a man of my standing offers her attention. Something cold moved through Violet's bloodstream. Not fear. Something older. Something her father had planted in her before he died. The stubborn, irrational refusal to bend simply because bending was easier. I'd rather be invisible for the rest of my life, she said, her voice steady and clear enough that 2 nearby couples turned their heads. Than visible because I smiled at a man who disgusts me. The silence that followed was the kind that makes rooms feel smaller. Hargrove's face went white, then red. His hand twitched at his side, not toward her, but in the abortive gesture of a man who realizes he has lost a confrontation in public and has no weapon left except retreat or escalation. He chose escalation. Your father died in debt, Hargrove said, loud enough for the nearest dozen people to hear. Your estate is rotting. Your uncle drinks away what's left. You are nothing, Miss Ashcombe. You are a ghost at a party, wearing a dead woman's dress. The cruelty of it was surgical. Every word chosen to wound maximally in minimum time. Violet felt the room's attention swing toward her like a spotlight, and in that white-hot glare of collective aristocratic judgment, she understood something fundamental about the world she inhabited. Mercy was performance, kindness was strategy, and the only people who survived were the ones who refused to let pain show on their faces. She did not cry. She did not look away. She held Hargrove's gaze the way a woman holds a knife, carefully, with full knowledge of what it could do. My father, Violet said quietly, died honest. Can your family say the same? The whisper that rippled through the crowd was involuntary and immediate. Everyone in London society knew the rumors about the Hargrove shipping fortune, the insurance fraud, the lost vessels that were never quite accounted for, the warehouse fire in Liverpool that killed 14 dock workers and enriched the family by £30,000. No one spoke of it openly, but Violet had just detonated the unspoken bomb in the middle of a royal ballroom, and the shrapnel was already flying. Hargrove's expression curdled into something beyond anger, something territorial and reptilian. He leaned in, his breath hot against Violet's face, and opened his mouth to deliver whatever final, devastating blow he had composed. Hargrove. The single word cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Not shouted, not raised, spoken with the flat, absolute authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because the world had learned to listen the first time. Hargrove froze. Violet watched the color drain from his face, not the white of anger this time, but the gray of genuine fear. He turned slowly, the way prey animals turn when they sense something behind them that they desperately hope is not what they think it is. Kedrick Blackthorne stood 6 feet away. I was tall, taller than Hargrove by 3 inches, broader across the shoulders by a margin that suggested not aristocratic leisure, but something more brutal underneath the tailored black evening coat. His hair was dark, almost black, swept back from a face that seemed designed by nature to intimidate. Hard jawline, deep-set eyes the color of iron, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to form the shape of a smile decades ago. He was 38 years old, and every one of those years was visible, not as weakness, but as accumulated weight. The weight of power held too long. The weight of decisions that had destroyed other men's lives. The weight of a reputation so fearsome that his name alone could empty a room or fill a courtroom. He held a glass of whiskey in his left hand. He had not drunk from it. The glass was merely a prop, a thin pretense of normalcy wrapped around a man who radiated anything but. "Your Grace," Hargrove said. His voice had changed completely. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by the strained politeness of a man standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground was not as solid as he thought. "I don't remember giving you permission to make a scene in my presence," Kedrick said. The possessive phrasing was deliberate. "Not at this event. Not in this room. In my presence." As though the air around him belonged to him. As though the entire ballroom existed within his personal territory, and Hargrove had committed the sin of disturbing it. "Your Grace, I was merely having a conversation with—" "You were performing," Kedrick said. "Badly. For an audience that is now embarrassed on your behalf." He paused, and the pause itself was violence. A held breath before a detonation. "Walk away." It was not a suggestion. It was not even a command in the traditional sense. It was a statement of what was going to happen, delivered with the certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed and had no framework for processing the possibility. Hargrove walked away. He did not excuse himself. He did not bow. He simply turned and moved through the crowd like a man fleeing a burning building while trying to maintain the appearance of a casual stroll. The crowd parted for him, not out of respect but out of the instinct to distance themselves from someone who had just been publicly diminished by the Duke of Blackthorn. Violet stood very still. Her heart was hammering. She could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the hollow of her collarbones, but she kept her body motionless. She had just watched one predator chase away another, and she was not naive enough to believe the second predator's intervention was altruistic. Kedrick turned his gaze to her, the full weight of it. And Violet understood in that instant why 300 people in a room fell silent when this man moved. His eyes did not look at her. They catalogued her. They moved across her face with the detached precision of someone assessing not beauty, not desirability, but value, worth. As though she were a painting he was considering acquiring, and he was determining whether the frame was worthy of the canvas. "You're Arthur Ashcombe's daughter," he said. Not a question. "I am. He owed me when he died." The brutality of the statement was breathtaking. No preamble, no softening, just the raw transactional reality of their relative positions delivered with the casual indifference of a man reading a balance sheet. "Then I suppose you're here to collect," Violet said. Something moved in Kedrick's expression. Not warmth, not amusement, something more unsettling, the faintest flicker of interest, like a predator that expected its prey to run, and instead watched it turn around. "Your father's debt was forgiven 3 years ago," Kedrick said. "I wrote it off. Dead men make poor debtors." "How generous." "It wasn't generosity. It was accounting. I don't waste resources pursuing what can't be recovered. And yet here you are, pursuing a conversation with his daughter." The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Violet counted them. In those 4 seconds, the Duke of Blackthorn looked at her with an expression she could not read, something between curiosity and calculation, between the detachment of a man who had stopped feeling things years ago and the sudden involuntary recognition that he was, in fact, feeling something now. "You talk too much," he said. "You talk like every word costs you money." "It does. My time has a price. Everyone in this room knows it." "Then you're wasting your investment standing here." Kedrick took a step closer. Not the aggressive encroachment Hargrove had attempted, something more controlled, more deliberate. The movement of a man who understood space and proximity as tools, not impulses. Violet caught his scent, leather, smoke, something dark and resinous that she could not identify, and felt her body respond before her mind could intervene. A tightening in her chest, a warmth at the base of her spine. The involuntary, traitorous recognition that danger and desire share the same nervous system. "You rejected Hargrove publicly," Kedrick said, "in a room full of people who could ruin you. He deserved it." "That's irrelevant. Deserving has nothing to do with survival. You understand that, don't you?" Violet met his eyes. Up close, they were worse. Not cold, as she had initially thought. Cold implied absence. What she saw in Cedric Blackthorn's eyes was presence, a vast, controlled, terrifying presence. Like looking into deep water and realizing the stillness on the surface is a lie, that something massive is moving underneath. I understand that surviving by swallowing insults isn't surviving, she said. It's just dying slowly. Cedric stared at her. The orchestra swelled into a waltz. Couples moved onto the dance floor around them, a swirling river of silk and propriety parting neatly around the two of them as though they occupied a separate geography, an island of tension in a sea of practiced elegance. How old are you? He said. 19. 19. He repeated the number like he was testing its weight. And you already know that survival and dignity are mutually exclusive. I know they shouldn't be. Shouldn't. He said the word the way someone says the name of a country they once visited and will never return to. Distant, faintly bitter. The vocabulary of people who haven't been broken yet. He turned and walked away. No farewell. No bow. No acknowledgement that the conversation had occurred at all. One moment he was there, massive, suffocating, impossible to ignore. And the next he was moving through the crowd like a dark current, and the crowd rearranged itself around him with the fluid, unconscious obedience of water yielding to stone. Violet exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath. Charlotte materialized at her elbow like a ghost with impeccable timing. What the hell was that? I have no idea. That was Cedric Blackthorn, the Duke of Blackthorn, the man who bankrupted the Earl of Whitmore last spring over a personal slight, the man who owns half the shipping lanes between here and India, the man who... Violet? Are you listening? I'm listening. He doesn't talk to people. He doesn't approach women at balls. He shows up, he watches, he leaves. That's what he does. He's been doing it for 10 years, and he just stood here and had an actual conversation with you while the entire room watched. He told me I talk too much. Oh God. What? Charlotte grabbed Violet's arm with a grip that was significantly stronger than her delicate frame suggested. When Cedric Blackthorn notices you, it's not flattering, it's not romantic. It's a catastrophe. The last woman he showed interest in, Lady Catherine Mercer, do you remember her? No, exactly, no one does. Because after Blackthorn was finished with her social circle, she moved to the countryside and hasn't been seen in London since. He doesn't court women, Violet. He acquires them. And when he's done, he discards them, and the wreckage he leaves behind is so complete that people forget they ever existed. Violet watched the crowd. Somewhere in it, the Duke of Blackthorn was moving. She could track his position by the way people shifted, the way conversations paused and restarted, the way the room's energy bent around him like light around a gravitational field. He said my father owed him money, Violet said. Your father owed everyone money. He said he forgave the debt. Charlotte went quiet. In 3 years of friendship, Violet had never seen Charlotte Pemberton go quiet voluntarily. Cedric Blackthorn doesn't forgive debts, Charlotte said finally. He doesn't forgive anything. If he told you he wrote off your father's debt, it means he wanted you to know he had the power to hold it over you and chose not to. It means he's already started. Started what? Whatever game he's playing. And Violet, you will not win it. No one does. The ball continued for 3 more hours. Violet danced twice, once with a nervous young baron who stepped on her feet and once with Charlotte's brother, who was kind enough not to comment on her dress. She ate small sandwiches that tasted like money. She smiled at women who did not smile back. She performed the exhausting theater of belonging in a world that had made it abundantly clear she did not. But through all of it, the music, the champagne, the brittle laughter, she felt it, a weight, a presence, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone who was not bothering to hide it. She caught him once. Across the ballroom, standing near the tall windows where the winter dark pressed against the glass like a living thing. Cedric Blackthorn was looking directly at her, not pretending to look elsewhere, not glancing, looking, with the same cataloging intensity as before, the same unsettling combination of detachment and focus, as though she were a problem he was solving in his head. Violet looked back, held his gaze for 5 full seconds, a small eternity in the silent language of ballrooms, and then deliberately turned her back. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. She knew it in the marrow of her bones the moment she did it. You do not turn your back on the Duke of Blackthorn. You do not dismiss him. You do not treat his attention as something you have the luxury of refusing. But Violet Ashcombe had spent 19 years learning one lesson above all others. The moment you show a powerful man that his attention controls you, you have already lost everything. The carriage ride home was cold. The Ashcombe carriage, the last remaining vehicle of a once impressive fleet, rattled through London streets that glistened with frost. Violet sat alone on the cracked leather seat, her mother's blue dress gathering wrinkles she would spend tomorrow trying to press out. Through the small window, London passed in fragments, gaslights, shadows, the occasional silhouette of a man walking too fast to be going somewhere innocent. Her uncle was asleep when she arrived. She could hear him through the study door, the thick, wet breathing of a man who had drunk himself unconscious for the third consecutive night. A bottle of port stood half empty on the hallway table, a crystal glass beside it bearing the ghost of his fingerprints. The house smelled like damp plaster and neglect. Somewhere above, a shutter banged in the wind, one of the upstairs windows whose latch had broken last autumn and which no one had the money to repair. Violet climbed the stairs to her room, peeled off the borrowed dress, hung it carefully on the wardrobe door, and sat on the edge of her bed in her shift. The room was freezing. The fire had gone out hours ago, and the remaining housemaid, singular, where there had once been 12, had gone home for the night. She sat in the dark and thought about Teeth, about the way Hargrove had bared his when she mentioned his family's reputation, about the way Caedric Blackthorne had not smiled at all, not once, as though smiling were a currency he refused to spend, about the fundamental architecture of the world she lived in, a world built on the bones of people who could not fight back, maintained by the silence of people who knew better but said nothing, and ruled by men who mistook cruelty for strength and called their hunger ambition. Her father had been a gentleman, brilliant, idealistic, catastrophically naive. He had believed that honesty and hard work would sustain the Ashcombe name, and the world had punished him for that belief with systematic, almost bureaucratic efficiency. His investments failed. His partners betrayed him. His health followed his fortune into the ground. By the end, Arthur Ashcombe had been so thoroughly destroyed that his death felt less like a tragedy and more like a formality, the period at the end of a sentence that society had already finished writing. Violet had been 15 when he died. She remembered his hands, always ink-stained, always gentle, and the way he looked at her in those final weeks, as though he were trying to memorize her face for a journey he could not describe. "Don't let them make you small, Violet," he had said. One of the last things. His voice barely above a whisper, his body failing in the methodical, impersonal way that bodies do when they have simply decided to stop. "They will try. God knows they will try. But you are not small. You were never small." She had carried those words like a stone in her chest for 4 years. Some days it felt like ballast, keeping her steady. Other days it felt like dead weight, dragging her under. Tonight, sitting in her dark, cold room in a crumbling house at the edge of a city that did not want her, Violet felt both. 3 days passed. London settled back into its gray winter rhythms. Fog, commerce, the quiet desperation of a city too wealthy to notice its own rot. Violet spent the days as she always did, managing the household accounts that grew thinner each month, reading in the library where half the shelves stood empty because her uncle had sold the books, and walking the grounds of the Ashcombe estate, which had once been beautiful and was now simply large. On the 4th morning, a carriage arrived. Not the kind of carriage Violet was accustomed to seeing. The modest, slightly battered vehicles of tradesmen and minor gentry. This was something else entirely. Black lacquer polished to a mirror finish. 4 horses, matching black, their breath steaming in the cold air. A coachman in livery so crisp, he looked like he had been assembled rather than dressed. And on the carriage door embossed in silver that caught the weak winter sun like a blade, the Blackthorn crest. Violet watched from the upstairs window. Her uncle, miraculously awake and vertical at 10 in the morning, stumbled to the front door with the desperate energy of a man who recognizes money the way a drowning man recognizes rope. The coachman did not step down. Instead, a footman emerged from the carriage, young, stone-faced, wearing the expression of someone who had been trained to deliver messages without editorializing, and handed Edward Ashcombe a single envelope. Violet was downstairs before her uncle had finished breaking the seal. "What is it?" Edward looked up. His face had undergone a remarkable transformation. The puffy, bleary confusion of his habitual hangover had been replaced by something alert, almost predatory. It was the face of a man who had just been handed unexpected leverage and was already calculating how to spend it. "It's an invitation," Edward said, "from the Duke of Blackthorn." "An invitation to what?" "A dinner, this Friday, at Blackthorn Manor." Edward's eyes moved over the letter again, and Violet could see his lips moving as he reread certain words, probably the ones that implied money. "He specifically requested your attendance." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass, a sharp, clear sound followed by the dangerous scatter of broken pieces. Violet felt her stomach tighten. "No," she said. Edward looked at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry? I said no, I'm not going." "You don't have the luxury of refusing. Watch me." Edward set the letter down on the hallway table, next to last night's empty wine glass, and turned to face his niece with the full force of whatever authority he believed he still possessed. He was a small man, not in stature, but in essence, the kind of man who inflated himself with borrowed power and other people's accomplishments, and still somehow never managed to fill the space. "Let me explain something to you, Violet, since you seem to have confused your situation with someone who has choices. This house is mortgaged, the land is mortgaged, your wardrobe, your food, the roof currently keeping rain off your ungrateful head. All of it exists because I have managed, through considerable effort, to keep creditors at bay. The Duke of Blackthorn is the most powerful man in England. If he wants you at his dinner table, you will be at his dinner table. You will smile, you will be charming, and you will do whatever is necessary to ensure that his interest in this family translates into something useful." "You mean something profitable?" "I mean something that keeps us alive." Violet stared at her uncle. She thought about her father, gentle, honest, destroyed. She thought about Cedric Blackthorn, powerful, cold, terrifying. She thought about the distance between survival and dignity, and the Duke's voice in her memory saying the two were mutually exclusive, and her own voice insisting they shouldn't be, and the way he had repeated the word shouldn't as though it were a relic from a language no one spoke anymore. "Fine," she said. "I'll go." Edward smiled. It was the worst kind of smile. The kind that reveals exactly how much a person is willing to sell and how little they need to be paid. "Wonderful. I'll have the seamstress alter your mother's green dress. The blue one is too shabby for Blackthorn Manor." He shuffled back toward his study, the letter clutched in his hand like a winning lottery ticket, and Violet stood alone in the hallway of her dead father's house, surrounded by the ghosts of better days and the unmistakable, suffocating sense that she had just agreed to step into a trap whose dimensions she could not yet see. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in bed and listened to the house settling around her, the creak of old wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant sound of her uncle snoring through his stupor. And she thought about the way Cedric Blackthorn had looked at her across that ballroom. The catalogue gaze, the weighing, the silence that felt more dangerous than any words. Charlotte's warning echoed in her mind. He doesn't court women, he acquires them. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the dark, honest place where she kept the truths she was not ready to speak aloud, Violet acknowledged something that frightened her more than the Duke's power, more than her uncle's greed, more than the slow erosion of everything she had ever known. When Cedric Blackthorn had looked at her, she had not wanted to run. She had wanted to look back. On Thursday evening, 24 hours before the dinner at Blackthorn Manor, a second package arrived at the Ashcombe estate. No carriage this time. A private courier, silent and efficient, who handed a large box to the housemaid and disappeared before anyone could question him. Violet opened the box in her room. Inside, nested in layers of tissue paper so white it seemed to glow, was a dress. Not her mother's green silk, not something borrowed or altered or resurrect from a kinder decade. A new dress, midnight black, cut from fabric so fine it felt like water against her fingers, with silver thread work along the bodice that caught the candlelight and scattered it like sparks. It was the most beautiful thing Violet had ever touched. It was also unmistakably, outrageously expensive, the kind of garment that did not simply cost money but represented it, that announced to anyone who saw it exactly how much someone had been willing to spend. There was no card, no note, no name. But Violet knew. She sat on the edge of her bed, the black dress pooled across her lap like spilled ink, and felt the trap close another inch around her. Because the dress was not just a gift, it was a statement, a declaration, a flag planted on territory the Duke had decided was his, delivered with the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who had never been told he could not have what he wanted. And tomorrow night, She would walk into his house wearing his colors, and every person in attendance would understand exactly what it meant. Violet folded the dress carefully, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. Then she pulled her mother's green silk from the wardrobe and began pressing it herself. Friday arrived like a sentence being carried out. The sky was iron gray. The air tasted like coming snow. The Ashcombe carriage, embarrassingly modest beside the gleaming vehicles that would populate Blackthorn Manor's drive, rattled through the London streets as the gas lights flickered to life one by one, turning the city into a constellation of small, cold flames. Violet wore the green dress. Her uncle had not noticed. Blackthorn Manor sat at the edge of Mayfair like a monument to a darker century. It was not merely large. London had plenty of large houses, but imposing in a way that felt deliberate, almost aggressive. Dark stone, tall, narrow windows, iron gates that opened with the weight and reluctance of something that preferred to remain closed. The grounds were immaculate, but the immaculacy itself felt threatening. Every hedge trimmed to geometrical precision, every gravel path raked clean, as though the estate existed in a state of permanent, vigilant control. A footman opened their carriage door. Violet stepped out into the cold evening and looked up at the house. And the house looked back at her with all its dark windows, and she thought, this is what power looks like when it stops pretending to be anything else. Inside, the entrance hall was vast and deliberately austere. No flowers, no warmth, no concession to comfort. Dark wood, stone floors. Portraits of Blackthorn ancestors lining the walls, each face harder and colder than the last, as though cruelty were a genetic inheritance that the family had been carefully breeding for generations. There were perhaps 40 guests. Violet recognized some from the ball. Minor lords, their wives, a handful of the wealthier merchant families who had bought their way into aristocratic circles. Everyone was dressed magnificently. Everyone was performing ease. And underneath the performance, every single person in that entrance hall was terrified, because the Duke of Blackthorn was descending the staircase. He wore black. Of course he wore black. The same darkness as the dress he had sent her, and Violet felt a cold spike of understanding pierce through her as she realized the coordination was intentional. He had wanted them to match. He had wanted the room to see them as a pair before a single word was exchanged. She was wearing green. Cedric Blackthorn reached the bottom of the staircase, and his gaze swept the room with the efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. And when his eyes found Violet Ashcombe standing near the door in her mother's green dress, not his black one, not his gift, not his claim, he stopped. The pause lasted less than a second, but Violet saw it. She saw the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the brief flash of something in those iron-gray eyes that might have been surprise, might have been anger, might have been, and this was the possibility that made her blood run cold and hot simultaneously, respect. He crossed the hall toward her. The crowd parted. It always parted. Miss Ashcombe, he said. His voice was low, controlled, stripped of every unnecessary inflection. You're wearing green. I am. I sent you a dress. You did. You chose not to wear it. Violet looked up at him. The full height, the full weight, the full terrifying presence of the man who owned half of England's shipping lanes and the other half of its fear. And she said, in a voice that did not waver, did not shake, did not bend, I don't wear what I'm told to wear, Your Grace. Not by my uncle, not by society, and not by you. The room held its breath. 40 guests, 60 staff, and one ancient house full of cold portraits, all of them suspended in the aspic of a single, impossible moment. A 19-year-old girl in a borrowed dress, standing in the entrance hall of the most powerful man in England and refusing him to his face. Cedric Blackthorn looked at her the way he had looked at her across the ballroom, that deep, cataloging, almost geological assessment. And then, for the first time in anyone's memory, the Duke of Blackthorn did something that no one in that room had ever witnessed. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has been searching for something for a very long time and has just, unexpectedly, impossibly, found it. Good, he said softly. So softly that only Violet heard it. Good. He turned and walked toward the dining room, and the crowd followed like a tide pulled by the moon, and Violet stood alone in the entrance hall for 3 more heartbeats, her pulse roaring in her ears, her hands trembling at her sides, and she understood with terrifying clarity that she had just done something far more dangerous than rejecting the Duke of Blackthorn. She had interested him, and as she moved to follow the others into dinner, she passed a window that reflected the dark grounds outside, and in that reflection, just for a moment, just at the edge of sight, she saw a figure standing at the manor's gate, a man in a long coat watching the house, watching her. And then the candlelight shifted and the reflection dissolved, and Violet told herself it was nothing, a trick of the glass, a shadow cast by the winter trees. But the cold that settled into her bones had nothing to do with the weather, because the figure at the gate had not been a stranger. The silhouette, the posture, the way he stood with one hand braced against the iron bars as though he had been standing there for hours, waiting. She knew that shape. She had seen it in a portrait that used to hang above her father's desk, a portrait her uncle had sold 2 years ago, a portrait of a man who was supposed to be dead. Violet did not move toward the dining room, not immediately. She stood at the window and stared at the place where the figure had been, and her mind did what it always did when confronted with something too large to process cleanly. It broke the thing into parts. The coat, the posture, the hand on the iron gate, the shape of a man who stood with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting in the dark. She catalogued each detail separately, the way her father had taught her to approach a problem that frightened you. Take it apart, name each piece, refuse to let the whole thing swallow you before you understood it. The portrait above her father's desk, sold 2 years ago by Edward, who sold everything eventually. A man with dark hair and a narrow face and eyes the color of winter light through dirty glass. Her father's oldest friend, his business partner, the man whose name appeared more than any other in the stack of letters she had found in the estate office 3 months after Arthur Ashcombe's death. Letters she had read once, understood partially, and locked in the bottom drawer of her father's desk with the instinct of someone who knows they have touched something dangerous. Thomas Vane, who had been declared dead 4 years ago, drowned off the coast of Dover in a boating accident that no one had witnessed and whose body was never recovered. Violet's hand pressed flat against the cold glass of the window. The grounds outside were empty, iron gate closed. The winter trees stood motionless in the frost, indifferent and unhelpful. Whatever she had seen, whoever she had seen, was gone. Miss Ashcombe. She turned. One of Blackthorn's footmen stood 3 feet away with the professionally neutral expression of a man paid to see nothing and remember less. His Grace requests that you join the other guests in the dining room. Requests. The word was technically accurate and completely dishonest. Nothing in this house was a request. Of course, Violet said, and followed him. The dining room was long and deliberately cold in its elegance. A table that seated 20 sat 30 tonight, and every additional chair was a statement about what the Duke of Blackthorn thought of conventional limits. Crystal and silver caught the candlelight. The guests were already seated, or rather, they were already arranged, because there was nothing spontaneous about the positioning of bodies at a Blackthorn dinner. Violet found her card at the right hand of the host's chair, and the hot, immediate understanding of what that placement communicated moved through her like a fever. She sat. She kept her face neutral. Cedric Blackthorn took his seat without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the performative graciousness that other powerful men deployed to disguise the machinery of their dominance. He sat because it was time to sit, and he began the meal because he had decided it should begin, and the 40 people at his table ate and drank and conversed in the particular register of people who are simultaneously desperate to impress someone and terrified of attracting too much of the wrong kind of attention. For the first 20 minutes, Cedric did not speak to Violet at all. She understood, after the first 5 minutes, that this too was intentional. Every other guest at the table was making the pilgrimage of small conversation, introductions, compliments on the meal, careful navigation of topics that would not offend the host. Violet sat at the right hand of the most powerful man in the room and received from him the studied, deliberate silence of someone who knew exactly how loud silence could be. She ate. She listened to the conversation of the elderly countess on her right, who was describing a property dispute in Somerset with the passionate specificity of someone who had been waiting all evening for a sympathetic ear. Violet offered the appropriate murmurs of interest. She drank her wine slowly because she had eaten very little today, and an empty stomach and nerves were a combination she could not afford. "You're not going to ask me why I seated you here." Cedric's voice came low and even, directed at his wine glass rather than at her, in the manner of a man accustomed to being heard without performing the act of speaking. I already know why, Violet said. Do you? You want the room to draw conclusions. The room already has. He turned his head and looked at her, the first time he had looked directly at her since she sat down. Up close, in candlelight, the hardness of his face was more complex than it had appeared in the ballroom. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested not smiling but something else, the long-term physical evidence of a man who had spent decades in a state of controlled tension. His jaw was set with the habitual tightness of someone who had learned early that expressions were liabilities. What conclusions have they drawn? That you've claimed me, that I'm under your protection, or your consideration, or whatever the appropriate word is for what a duke does when he decides a girl is useful. And what do you think the appropriate word is? I think the appropriate word changes depending on what you intend. A pause. He lifted his wine glass. Did not drink. Set it down. Most women in your position would find this flattering, he said. Most women in my position haven't thought carefully about the word position. Something shifted in his face. That same quality as before, the involuntary, almost reluctant acknowledgement of something unexpected. He looked away from her, back toward the table, and Violet watched his profile in the candlelight, the hard line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the way he occupied his chair with the stillness of a man who had no need to fidget because the world rearranged itself around him rather than the other way around. Your father, he said, was a man who trusted people he shouldn't have. Yes. Specifically, he trusted Thomas Vane. The name detonated in Violet's chest. She kept her breathing even through pure will, kept her hands still on the tablecloth, kept her eyes forward and not turned toward Cadric, because turning would have told him something he did not yet need to know. Thomas Vane is dead, she said. Is he? 2 words. Not a question. The flattest possible delivery of 2 syllables that contained a volume of implication she could not immediately measure. Violet felt her pulse accelerate, felt it in her throat, in the tips of her fingers, and underneath the fear, underneath the cold shock of it, something else. The sharp, adrenaline-bright sensation of a pattern resolving, of pieces that had been lying scattered for 4 years suddenly being pushed together by an invisible hand. What do you know about Thomas Vane? She asked. Her voice came out steady. She was surprised, and not surprised. More than you do. Then why are you telling me at a dinner table in front of 40 people? Because I want to see what you do with it. Violet turned her head and looked at him. He was already looking at her. The candlelight made shadows of his eyes, turned them darker, stripped away whatever thin veneer of social civility the setting imposed and left something more fundamental visible beneath. This was a man who had long ago stopped pretending that power and cruelty were different things, who had made some fundamental accommodation with the worst version of himself, and had found, in that accommodation, a terrible kind of freedom. And he was watching her with the focused, specific attention of someone who had found, unexpectedly, a puzzle worth solving. You're testing me, Violet said. I'm always testing. Everyone at this table is being tested. Most of them don't know it. What happens to the ones who fail? They stop being useful. And then they stop being anything. He said it with the same tone he might use to discuss crop rotation or weather patterns. The absolute matter-of-factness of a man for whom the ruin of other people's lives was simply an operational reality. You're not going to fail. You don't know that. I know that you walked into my house in your dead mother's dress instead of the one I sent you. I know that you looked at Hargrove in a room full of people who could bury you and didn't blink. I know that Thomas Vane's name just landed on you like a blow to the chest and your face hasn't moved. He paused. You don't fail, Miss Ashcombe. You absorb. There's a difference. And people who absorb last longer than people who simply resist. The dinner progressed. Courses arrived and were removed. Conversations rose and fell in the elaborate, practiced rhythms of people who had spent their lives performing comfort they did not feel. Violet ate what was put in front of her, spoke when spoken to, laughed at the Countess's property dispute anecdotes with the precise calibration of genuine warmth, and underneath all of it she turned Cadric's words over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath. He knew about Thomas Vane. He knew Vane was not dead. And he had chosen to tell her, had chosen this moment, this setting, this particular method of delivery, with the intention of watching her response. which meant she was not simply a potential acquisition to him. She was a variable in something larger, a factor in a calculation she could not yet see the full shape of, the part of her that had read every letter in her father's desk drawer, that had spent 4 years quietly cataloging the inconsistencies in Arthur Ashcombe's financial ruin, that had never fully accepted the official account of what had destroyed her family. That part of her felt something sharpened to a point. After dinner, the guests migrated to the drawing room. Kedrick disappeared briefly, absorbed by a cluster of older men near the fireplace. The kind of conversation conducted in low voices and communicating not through words, but through the practiced semaphore of men who had been making large decisions together for decades. Violet accepted a cup of tea from a footman and stationed herself near the far window, and Charlotte materialized beside her within 90 seconds. "You were seated at his right hand," Charlotte said without preamble. "I noticed." The last person seated at his right hand at a private dinner was Lord Ashford, and 3 weeks later Ashford's trading company was absorbed into Blackthorn Industries, and Ashford himself retired to the country. "I'm not a trading company." "No, you're significantly more complicated." Charlotte's voice had dropped to the urgent, pressured whisper of a woman who was genuinely frightened on someone else's behalf. "Violet, what did he say to you?" "He mentioned my father." "He mentioned—" Charlotte stopped, recalibrated. "Kedrick Blackthorn mentioned your father to you at his own dinner table. And Thomas Vane." The cup in Charlotte's hand developed a slight, betraying tremor. She steadied it with both hands and glanced across the room with the elaborate casualness of someone performing a lack of interest they absolutely did not feel. "Don't say that name again tonight," Charlotte said. "Not here, not in this house. You know who he is." "Everyone who was paying attention 4 years ago knows who he is, or was, or—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, the rapid assessment of loyalty against safety, information against risk. "The story that was officially told about Thomas Vane's death is not the story that actually happened. That's the beginning and end of what I'll say in this building." "Charlotte, no." Firm. Absolute. The voice of a woman who had drawn a line and knew exactly why the line existed. "Not here. Come to me on Sunday. Come in the afternoon. We'll talk then." Her eyes moved quickly across the room and snapped back to Violet's face. "And for whatever time you're still in this house tonight, do not let him isolate you. Do not agree to any private conversation. Do not—" She stopped. Her face changed. Kedrick had crossed the room. He was standing 3 feet away, holding a glass of brandy, and his expression communicated nothing except the absolute calm of a man who owned every square inch of the floor he was standing on. "Miss Pemberton," he said, "your brother is looking for you. Something about his carriage." Charlotte held his gaze for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to demonstrate that she was leaving by choice, not by command. And then she set her teacup down, inclined her head fractionally, and moved toward the door with measured steps. Kedrick watched her go without expression. Then he turned to Violet. "She's protective of you," he said. "She's a good friend. She's frightened. Intelligent people usually are." He studied her for a moment, then turned to look out the window at the dark grounds below. Violet stood beside him and looked at the same darkness and felt the profound, disorienting strangeness of standing voluntarily next to a man who frightened her, not because she had no choice, but because, and this was the truth she could not yet afford to examine too closely, something in her recognized something in him. Not comfort, nothing as soft as comfort, recognition. The particular resonance of 2 people who have learned identical lessons about the world from entirely different directions. "The man at the gate earlier," Violet said. She kept her voice even, kept her eyes on the window. "The one I saw before dinner." A pause. Not the pause of surprise. The pause of a man deciding exactly how much to confirm. "You saw him," Kedrick said. "I did." "And you said nothing." "I'm saying something now." He turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, something she could almost name. Not warmth. She was beginning to understand that warmth was a language this man had either never learned or had deliberately unlearned, but something in the territory adjacent to it. Attention of a quality that was not purely tactical. The specific, rare quality of attention given to something that has surprised you. "He's been watching this house for 2 weeks, Kedrick said. "He watched your house before that. Whatever your father left behind, letters, documents, records, Vane wants them. and he has become motivated enough to stop pretending he's dead to get them. The cold that moved through Violet had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The letters in my father's desk. I would assume so. You've known about this. I've been aware of the situation, and you invited me to dinner. She turned and looked at him directly, the full weight of it. You brought me here to this house, knowing that a man who faked his own death was watching my movements, and you did it to... She stopped. Thought. Let the shape of it form. You did it to draw him out. You wanted him to see me here. You wanted him to see your crest on the carriage that came to my door. Kedrick did not confirm this. He did not need to. The absence of denial was its own kind of answer. You used me, Violet said. I protected you, he said. There's a difference. That's the second time tonight you've told me that two things are different when they look exactly the same from where I'm standing. From where you're standing, you can't see the full picture. Then show it to me. He turned toward her fully. In the candlelight, with the dark grounds behind him, and the noise of the party at their backs, he was something beyond the social category of dangerous older nobleman. He was the thing that category had been invented to describe inadequately. A man who had looked at the rules of the world, the unspoken agreements between powerful people and their victims, and had decided not to pretend those rules constrained him. Thomas Vane destroyed your father, Kedrick said, deliberately and with planning. The financial collapse was not an accident. Vane manipulated your father's investments, redirected capital, forged correspondence, and then staged his own death when the operation was complete and the money was safely moved. He paused. The money in question was not just your father's. Whose else? Mine. The word sat between them like something physical. Violet felt the room shift. Not literally, not dramatically, but in the way that rooms shift when the fundamental architecture of a situation reveals itself and everything you understood before turns out to have been reading the wrong blueprint. You were his partner, she said. His mark. There's a difference. A ghost of something crossed his face, the buried residue of an anger too old and too controlled to manifest as anything except the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth. I recovered. Your father didn't. I've spent 4 years tracking Vane, and 4 years is a long time to wait for someone to make a mistake. He made one tonight. He made one the moment he came back to London. Kedrick's voice was even, measured, and underneath the evenness was something enormous and still, the compressed weight of years of patience coiled around a purpose. I will find him. When I find him, the consequences will be total. That part doesn't require your involvement. But some part does. The letters, Kedrick said. Whatever your father kept in that desk. If Vane wants them, it means they contain something that could be used against him. Evidence. Account numbers. Names. Whatever he left behind when he ran, your father kept. And if your uncle sells them, or if Vane reaches them first, my uncle doesn't know they exist, Violet said, and Vane won't find them. You sound very certain. I moved them 3 months after my father died. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they were worth keeping. She held his gaze. Where they are now is the only piece of information in this conversation that is mine and only mine. Another one of those pauses, the pauses of a man recalibrating. You're 19 years old, Kedrick said, and the way he said it was not condescension. It was something closer to the involuntary acknowledgement that a fact you keep encountering refuses to stop being surprising. I'm aware of my age. And you've been sitting on evidence that could destroy Thomas Vane for 4 years without knowing what it was. Without knowing specifically what it was. I knew it was dangerous. Dangerous things are worth keeping. That's a remarkably cold way of thinking for someone your age. Poverty is a remarkably effective teacher. He looked at her for a long moment. The drawing room noise continued behind them. The clinking of crystal, the measured performance of aristocratic conversation, the violin somewhere that someone had started playing with more enthusiasm than skill. All of it felt very far away. I want those letters, Kedrick said. I know you do. I can protect you. Your family. Your estate. Everything your uncle has been methodically destroying for the past 4 years. I can stop. I can rebuild it. I can make the name Ashcombe mean something again in this city. In exchange for the letters. In exchange for working together to find Vane and finish this. Violet looked at him, and she did not look away. And she thought about her father's hands, always ink-stained, always gentle. She thought about Thomas Vane standing at an iron gate in the dark after 4 years of pretending to be dead. She thought about Charlotte's face when she said not here, and about the bottom drawer of her father's desk, which was no longer in her father's desk, had not been for 4 years, was currently hidden in a place that it required knowing the Ashcombe estate's original architectural plans to locate. She thought about the word protection and all the shapes that word could take. "I'll give you my answer on Sunday," she said. Something moved in his jaw. Attention. The brief involuntary response of a man who was not accustomed to being made to wait. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday." He studied her one final moment. Then he turned, walked back toward the center of the room, and was immediately absorbed into the current of his own party. Surrounded, attended to, the fixed point around which everything else rotated. Within 30 seconds, he was deep in conversation with a shipping magnate from Bristol, his attention complete and apparently total, and Violet could not tell whether the pivot was indifference or performance. She suspected, with the instinct of someone who was learning to read a difficult text, that with Cedric Blackthorne, the answer was always both. Her carriage came at 11. The ride home through the frosted streets was as cold as the ride there, and the house was as dark, and her uncle was as unconscious, and nothing on the surface of her life had changed. But when Violet climbed the stairs to her room and lit a candle and sat on the edge of her bed, she reached under the mattress. Not from any impulse toward drama, but from the practical, unsentimental understanding that the safest place to keep a critical document in a house full of people who would sell anything was underneath the only piece of furniture no one else had reason to move. And she pulled out the single letter she kept separate from the others, the one she had read more times than she could count. It was addressed to her father. The handwriting was Thomas Vane's, she knew it from the others, but the tone was different from the business correspondence, colder, more deliberate. The letter of a man not writing to a partner but to a target, laying out in careful, elegant language exactly what he intended to take and exactly why Arthur Ashcombe would never see it coming. There was a line near the end. She had never fully understood it. When Blackthorne falls, everything else falls with him. Your daughter will be the key to that. She simply won't know it yet. Violet sat in the candlelight and read that line for perhaps the 40th time. And for the 40th time she felt the cold precision of it settle into her bones. 4 years ago it had been a threat whose meaning she could not decode, a warning about a future she could not map. Tonight, having sat at the right hand of the Duke of Blackthorne in his own house, having watched him deploy her presence as a signal to a dead man who was not dead, having accepted a Sunday deadline for a decision that would commit her irrevocably to one side of a war she had not known she was already standing in the middle of, tonight the line meant something different. Tonight it meant that Thomas Vane had known about her before she knew about any of this, which meant that whatever was coming on Sunday, whatever answer she gave Cedric Blackthorne, someone else had already been planning for her to give it. The candle guttered. Outside, something moved in the garden below her window. A sound too deliberate for wind, too quiet for animal. Violet did not blow out the candle. She did not move toward the window. She sat very still on the edge of her bed, the letter in her hands, and listened. And from somewhere below, barely audible, through the old walls of the house, a door she was certain her uncle had locked that evening, opened, and then, with the careful, unhurried patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, closed. Violet did not call out, did not reach for the candle to extinguish it, though every instinct pushed her toward darkness as cover. She understood, in the first cold second after that door closed, that the decision she made in the next 30 seconds would determine whether she survived the next 30 minutes. The candle stayed lit. She needed to see. She folded the letter, slid it into the bodice of her shift against her sternum, where the warmth of her skin would keep it, and the fabric would hide it. Then she stood and picked up the iron candlestick, not as a light source anymore, but as the only weapon in the room, and moved to the door. The hallway was dark. Below, the house breathed its usual nighttime sounds, the groan of settling wood, the distant percussion of her uncle's snoring, the wind finding the gaps in the east wing. But underneath those sounds, something else. Footsteps. Careful ones. The footsteps of a person who knew how to move through a house without ownership of it. The particular quiet of someone who had learned which floorboards to avoid, which stairs to skip, which rhythms of an old building to use as cover rather than fight against. Someone who had been inside this house before. Violet pressed her back against the wall beside her door and waited. The footsteps paused at the base of the stairs. She heard breathing, controlled, measured, not hurried. Then they resumed, and they were coming up. She had two choices. She could lock herself in and scream for her uncle, who would wake confused and drunk and useless, or she could do the thing that her father had never been able to do in time. Move first. She moved first. She stepped into the hallway at the top of the stairs the exact moment the shadow reached the landing, and she brought the iron candlestick up with both hands and said, with a steadiness she did not feel anywhere below the throat, "I'll take your eye out. I've done worse with less." She hadn't, but the voice didn't know that. The shadow stopped, raised both hands. The candle threw enough light to turn a silhouette into a face, and Violet looked at that face, and the floor seemed to shift under her feet. Not dramatically, not the way stories described it, but the quiet, seismic displacement of a person whose understanding of the last 4 years just cracked along a fault line she had not known existed. Thomas Vane was 51 years old and looked 70. Whatever the years since his disappearance had been, they had not been gentle. His face had the hollowed, wind-scoured quality of a man who had spent a long time outside and afraid. The dark hair from the portrait was now mostly gray, cropped close. The narrow eyes, winter light through dirty glass, exactly as she remembered them from childhood visits when she was small enough to hide under her father's desk, were the same, but the thing behind them had changed. The cold intelligence was still there, but the confidence that had animated it was gone, replaced by something rawer and more desperate. "Violet," he said. His voice was a stranger's voice in a familiar register. "I need you to put that down and listen to me. I don't need to do anything you tell me. I know that. I'm not here to—" He stopped, recalculated. She watched him do it, watched the machinery of a man who had spent years surviving by reading situations, assessing angles, finding the precise pressure point that would open a door. Then she watched that machinery stall out, because there was no pressure point here. She was not the girl he had been planning for. She was not afraid of him in the way that made people negotiable. "I came to explain." "You came for the letters." His eyes moved, just fractionally, just enough, an involuntary tell. "Among other things." "The letters aren't here. I know they're not in the desk. I already—" He stopped again, closed his mouth. "You already checked," Violet said. "Before tonight. You were in this house before tonight." The silence confirmed it. Violet felt something cold and specific settle in her chest. Not fear, but the particular kind of anger that arrives when you understand you have been underestimated for a long time by someone who should have known better. "How many times?" she asked. "Twice. The letters weren't— How many times have you been inside my father's house without permission?" The phrasing landed, my father's house. The possessive she almost never used, because the estate belonged to Edward in all the ways that mattered financially, and to no one in all the ways that mattered actually. But in this moment it was true with a force that surprised her. This had been Arthur Ashcombe's house. This man had destroyed Arthur Ashcombe, and then he had come back and walked through the wreckage looking for evidence of what he had done. "Violet, what I did to your father was planned," she said, "from the beginning. I have your letters, the ones you wrote to him, and the one you wrote to yourself about him." She watched his face. "The one where you wrote that I would be the key to bringing Blackthorn down, without knowing it." Thomas Vane went very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm but its opposite. The absolute physical arrest of a man whose mind is moving very fast while his body has been ordered not to reveal it. "You read that letter," he said, 4 years ago. "And you didn't—" He stopped, worked through it. "You didn't go to Blackthorn. I didn't know what it meant 4 years ago. And now? Now I had dinner at his table and he told me you weren't dead." She kept the candlestick raised. Her arms ached. She did not lower it. "He wants the letters too. Everyone wants the letters. So perhaps you'd like to tell me what's actually in them that makes two powerful men willing to drop every pretense to get to a girl in a borrowed dress." Vane looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, the house creaked. Somewhere far below, Edward Ashcombe turned over in his stupid sleep, and the springs of his chair protested, and then there was silence again. "Your father," Vane said slowly, "kept records of every transaction, every transfer, every document I had him sign. He didn't know what he was signing, but he kept copies of everything. That was Arthur. Meticulous. Trusting and meticulous, the worst possible combination." Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the ghost of a person who had once been capable of guilt, haunting the features of the person who had replaced him. "Those records prove what I moved and where I moved it. They proved the shell companies. They proved the insurance fraud. They proved that the Liverpool fire was not an accident. Hargrove's family, Violet said. Hargrove's father, I worked with him. We both worked with Blackthorne, and then we both moved against him. And when it started to collapse, Hargrove Sr. bought his way back into safety, and I ran. His voice was flat, factual. The recitation of a man who had rehearsed this confession so many times it had lost its texture. The records in those letters don't just implicate me, Violet. They implicate the Hargrove family. They implicate 3 other noble families whose names are in those documents. And they implicate a magistrate and 2 members of the House of Lords who helped us move the legal paperwork. Violet's arms lowered the candlestick by 2 inches. She did not notice until later. Blackthorne knows this, she said. Blackthorne knows some of it. He's been rebuilding the picture for 4 years, but he doesn't have the documents. Without the documents, it's his word, his reputation, his wealth, his influence against theirs. And as powerful as Blackthorne is, 5 noble families, 2 lords, and a magistrate against 1 duke is a battle he could lose. Vane's eyes were steady now, stripped of pretense, looking at her with the unadorned directness of a man who has run out of room for performance. The letters are the difference between Blackthorne winning and Blackthorne being destroyed. And if he's destroyed, everyone who aligned with him goes down. Everyone he's protected. He hasn't protected me. He invited you to dinner and seated you at his right hand in front of 40 witnesses. In Caedric Blackthorne's world, that is protection. That is a declaration. Vane took 1 careful step forward. He has already decided you're his, and if his enemies move against him using those documents, then I go down with him. You were always going to go down with him. That was the plan, my plan, 4 years ago. He said it with the exhausted honesty of a man who is past the point of dressing his sins in better clothes. I wrote that letter because I needed leverage against Blackthorne that he wouldn't see coming. Your father's ruin was half of it. You were meant to be the other half. A girl with no money, no name, no power, who Blackthorne would dismiss until it was too late. Someone who could get close to him because he'd underestimate her. Someone I could use when the time came. The candlelight between them was very still. No draft, no movement. The flame burned straight and clean and indifferent. But I didn't use you, Vane said. I ran instead, and I spent 4 years telling myself that meant something. He stopped. His jaw moved. The ghost of guilt had apparently not fully vacated. It doesn't mean anything. I still destroyed your father. I still plan to destroy you. The only difference between the person I was and the person I am is that I was too afraid to finish it. Violet looked at him for a long time. She thought about what Caedric had said across the dinner table. You absorb. And she understood now why that quality had distinguished her, and what it had cost to develop it, and what it was worth. Get out of this house, she said. Violet, if you're not out of this building in 60 seconds, I will scream loud enough to bring every constable within 3 streets. And when they come, I will tell them exactly who you are and exactly where you've been for 4 years, and Caedric Blackthorne will have you before morning. She lowered the candlestick fully, looked at him with the specific earned coldness of someone who has stopped feeling sorry for a situation and started managing it. I'm not your leverage, I'm not your plan, and I'm not a girl who doesn't know what's happening to her anymore. Thomas Vane looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely categorize, something between defeat and recognition, the look of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone he himself designed the architecture to manipulate. Then he turned and went back down the stairs and through the door he had come in by, and the latch clicked with the same careful quiet as before. Violet stood in the dark hallway until she heard nothing more. Then she went back to her room, set the candlestick down, and sat on the floor instead of the bed because the floor felt more solid. She did not sleep. By dawn she had made her decision, but the decision was not what she had expected it to be. Lying on her bed, watching the gray winter light come through the curtains, she realized that the choice was not between Vane and Blackthorne, not between 2 powerful men who both wanted something from her. The choice was simpler and harder than that. The choice was whether she was going to remain the variable in other people's equations or become the person who wrote the equation. She was at Charlotte's house by 9 in the morning, before the acceptable hour for calling, and Charlotte opened the door herself, which meant she had been watching for her. He came, Charlotte said, last night. How did you... Because I know how he thinks. I've known about Vane for longer than you have. Charlotte stepped back to let her in. The drawing room was warm. Tea was already on the table, poured and waiting, which confirmed that Charlotte had been expecting this visit for hours. My father was on the periphery of it. Not involved, not directly, but he knew enough that when Vane disappeared, it was never a surprise to him. It was a relief. She sat down and watched Violet with the careful attention of someone braced for impact. What did he tell you? Violet told her. All of it. The full confession, the names, the House of Lords, the magistrate, the architecture of the plan that had included her without her knowledge. She told it the way she had spent the night processing it, clinically, sequentially, stripping each piece of its emotional charge and examining it as information. Charlotte listened without interrupting. That alone was significant. Charlotte Pemberton never listened without interrupting. When Violet finished, Charlotte set down her teacup and stared at the fireplace for a moment. Vane gave you all of that, Charlotte said finally. Yes. He walked into your house in the middle of the night and confessed to a plan to destroy Cadric Blackthorne using you as the instrument, and then he left. Yes, Violet. Charlotte turned to look at her. He didn't do that out of guilt. He doesn't have the capacity left for guilt. 4 years on the run removes it. He did that because he wants you to take those letters to Blackthorne. He wants you to give Blackthorne everything, consolidate whatever relationship is forming between the two of you, and become exactly what he originally planned you to be, deeply embedded in Blackthorne's world. Trusted. Intimate. She paused. He's not running anymore. He's realigned. He came to you last night because you're still the plan. You're just the updated version of it. The tea in Violet's cup steamed gently. She looked at it and felt the full dimensional weight of what Charlotte had just said, the sickening recursive quality of it, a trap that reformed itself around every attempt to escape it. A man who had spent 4 years in exile refining his strategy, who had walked into her house not to abandon his plan, but to seed its next phase with information she would believe because it was true. The letters were real, the names were real, the implications were real, and none of that changed the fact that Vane had handed her that information with deliberate precision. He wants me to give the letters to Blackthorne on Sunday, Violet said, and cement yourself as his most valuable ally. Yes. And if I do, you become permanently entangled in whatever war Blackthorne is fighting. Those 5 families, those lords, that magistrate, they will all eventually know you were the source. They will come for you. Not Blackthorne. You. Charlotte's voice was steady, but her hands were not. They sat in her lap with the contained, deliberate stillness of hands that were working to keep themselves still. And if you don't give Blackthorne the letters, Vane finds another way to move them against him. The whole structure collapses anyway, and you're standing in the rubble with nothing. Violet set down her teacup, stood up, walked to the window and looked at Charlotte's garden, tidy, frost-silvered, the canes of dormant roses tied to their supports with careful twine. There's a third option, Violet said. There isn't. There is. I go to Blackthorne on Sunday. I give him the letters. She paused. But I tell him everything Vane told me, including that Vane planned this, including that I was meant to be the instrument, including that the version of events I am delivering was constructed by a man who wants Blackthorne to trust me for his own purposes. Charlotte was quiet. I give him the truth instead of the information, Violet said. All of it. Including the parts that make me look like a pawn. That's... Charlotte stopped. What? That's either the most honest thing I've ever heard, or the most sophisticated play I've ever heard, and I genuinely cannot tell which. Neither can I, Violet said, but it's the only version where I'm not lying to someone about what I know. She turned from the window. Charlotte was watching her with an expression that had traveled through shock, calculation, and something else, something that might, on a different face, have been called admiration. One more thing, Violet said. The letters. I need to move them again tonight, before Sunday, somewhere that neither Vane nor Blackthorne can access without my active participation. Where? Somewhere that requires me to be present, alive, and uncoerced to retrieve them. Which means that whatever happens on Sunday, whichever version of this plays out, I am not expendable to either of them. She held Charlotte's gaze. I need to become the lock, not the key. Charlotte stared at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her teacup, drank from it with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided to do something irreversible and is making peace with that decision, and said, My father's solicitor has a vault. Violet arrived at Blackthorne Manor on Sunday afternoon in the Ashcombe carriage, wearing her own clothes, carrying nothing except the composure she had spent the past 48 hours rebuilding from the ground up. The footman who opened the gate looked at her and then looked past her at the carriage, searching, she understood, for the letter she had been expected to bring. She had brought something else instead. Kedrick received her in his study, which was exactly as she had expected, darker and more personal than the public rooms, the kind of space that accumulated the real character of its occupant rather than performing it. Books that had actually been read, maps with handwritten notations, a desk whose surface spoke of genuine work rather than display. He stood when she entered, which she had not expected, and the small involuntary courtliness of it told her something she filed carefully away. "You're on time," he said. "I'm early. You don't strike me as a man who respects lateness." "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which was a power arrangement she recognized and chose not to contest, because the contest she had come to have was a different one. "Thomas Vane came to my house Thursday night," she said. Every muscle in Kedrick's body was already still, but the quality of the stillness changed. The way a held breath is different from an exhaled one, even when neither makes sound. She told him everything. She did not modulate it, did not sequence it strategically, did not choose the most favorable framing. She told him what Vane had said, what Vane had confessed, and then she told him what Charlotte had identified, that the confession itself was a move, that she had been the plan for 4 years, that Vane had handed her information like a man handing someone a loaded weapon while pretending to be unarmed. She watched Kedrick's face while she spoke. It was the most controlled human face she had ever observed, more controlled than Edward's practiced indifference, more controlled than the theatrical composure of the aristocrats who performed ease at parties. His face was controlled the way load-bearing walls were controlled, not decorative, but structural, maintaining the shape of everything built on top of it. But when she told him about the letter, "Your daughter will be the key, she simply won't know it yet," she saw something fracture through that control, something that crossed his jaw and his eyes in the space of a single second, gone before it was fully formed. It was not anger. It was older than anger. The specific, deeply buried thing that anger is used to cover when a man has spent his entire adult life building defenses precisely because he knows what it costs to be taken by surprise. He had not known. About the letter. About her. Violet felt, in that moment, the precise weight of what that meant. This man, feared across England, possessed of more information and more influence than any single person she had ever encountered, had been pursuing a plan for 4 years without knowing that the most important variable in it had been placed there deliberately by his enemy. That the girl who had rejected Hargrove at the winter ball and caught his attention and refused his dress and earned his unusual, unsettling interest had been positioned in his orbit by Thomas Vane as a weapon against him. She let the silence sit, gave him the space of it. "The letters," Kedrick said. His voice was flat, completely flat. The flatness of something that has gone too deep for inflection to survive. "In a solicitor's vault, accessible only with my presence and my explicit consent." She held his eyes. "Not because I don't trust you." "Then why?" "Because Vane does trust me, with you. And the only way I can be useful to you and not to him is if the letters are mine, fully, in a way that cannot be transferred or coerced." She paused. "You can't take them from me. He can't take them from me. Which means neither of you can cut me out of this, and both of you have to deal with me as a person rather than a resource." The silence in that study was the longest silence she had yet endured in his presence. Outside, the winter garden sat still and frost-white beyond the tall windows. The fire in the grate worked steadily at its job. Kedrick Blackthorne looked at her with an expression she would spend years trying to accurately name, and she looked back at him, and the line between them was not attraction, was not simply strategy, was not the clean arc of a story about power and innocence. It was something thornier and more honest than any of that. Two people who had each, in their own way, been used by the same man. Two people sitting in a room with the rubble of 4 years of someone else's planning and no clean way forward. "You could have walked away," Kedrick said, "taken the letters, disappeared somewhere beyond Vane's reach and mine." "My father's name is in those letters," Violet said. "He was destroyed by what they document. If I disappear with them, his name stays destroyed. So this is about your father. This is about a lot of things." She held his gaze. "Some of them are about you." Another silence, shorter this time. "Vane will move," Kedrick said. "When he realizes you didn't play it the way he planned, he'll move against us directly. He has nothing left to lose, and that makes him more dangerous than anything I've faced in this whole affair." "I know." The families in those documents, when they learn you have evidence, I know. You understand what you're committing to. I understand that I've been committed to it for 4 years without my knowledge, Violet said, and I would rather be committed to it on my own terms. Kedrick was quiet. He turned to the window and looked out at the white garden. Violet watched his back, the line of his shoulders, the absolute control of a man who was reordering something fundamental inside himself and had no intention of letting her see the full extent of it. When he turned back, his face was set, the same hard architecture as always, but something in it had shifted in a way she couldn't precisely measure. Not softer, nothing so simple as softer. More present, perhaps. Less defended. The faintest loosening of something that had been locked down so long it had begun to calcify. Monday morning, he said, I'll have my solicitor review the arrangements for the vault. It stays in your name. Your access, your consent. Those are the terms. Violet nodded. And you stay close, he said. The words were direct, operational, stripped of the social lubricant that other men used to disguise what they meant. Not for the letters. Because Vane knows where you sleep, and he has already been inside your house twice, and you are not going back there to wait for a third visit. Violet opened her mouth, closed it. The argument she had prepared about propriety, about independence, about the specific trap of accepting protection from powerful men, dissolved against the simple physical truth of it. Thomas Vane knew her house. Thomas Vane knew her habits. Thomas Vane had spent 4 years preparing for this. There are arrangements, Kedrick said. A property. A residence under a different name where your uncle won't find you, and neither will Vane's people. You will not be a prisoner. You will not be owned. His jaw moved. Those are words I've never said to anyone before, and I would prefer not to have to repeat them. I believe you, Violet said. That's the part that concerns me. The faintest shift at the corners of his eyes. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent. The ghost of an expression a man makes when he has not been surprised in a very long time and has been surprised twice in the same conversation. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. She stood to leave. At the door of his study, she stopped, turned back. Kedrick, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. They both knew it. The air in the room registered it the way air registers a change in pressure, not dramatically but completely, affecting everything within its range. When this is over, she said, when Vane is finished, and the letters have done what they need to do, and your name is clear, I need you to understand that I will still be a person with my own intentions, not a possession, not an asset you acquired. He looked at her across the study. The fire worked between them. 40 years of ruthlessness and 4 years of obsessive patience and whatever unnamed thing had been accumulating since the night she turned her back on him in a ballroom, all sat in that silence together. I understood that the night you wore the green dress, he said. Violet walked out of Blackthorn Manor into the iron-cold afternoon. The carriage waited. The coachman did not ask where she was going, which told her Kedrick had already spoken to him. She sat in the carriage and felt the full irreversibility of the last 72 hours settle into her body like cold water finding its level. There was no version of forward that led back to the life she had been living. The forgotten girl in the borrowed dress, standing at the edge of ballrooms, watching the world from a safe and powerless distance, that person was simply gone. What had replaced her was not yet fully formed, but it was already, irrevocably, something that could not be undone. The carriage moved through the London streets, and behind her the gates of Blackthorn Manor closed, and somewhere in the city Thomas Vane was recalibrating with the cold, patient efficiency of a man who had survived 4 years by being willing to change shape, and 5 noble families were going about their Sunday afternoons, unaware that the ground beneath them had already begun to move. And Violet Ashcombe pressed her hand against the letter still hidden against her sternum, and understood that the war had not been declared today. It had simply been acknowledged by everyone who was actually in it. The property Kedrick had arranged was a townhouse in Bloomsbury, narrow, anonymous, tucked between a bookbinder and a tea merchant on a street where nobody of consequence lived and therefore nobody of consequence watched. Violet moved into it on Monday morning with 3 dresses, her father's letters, and the specific stripped-down clarity of a person who has shed everything non-essential and discovered the weight they had been carrying. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Bowen, 50, efficient, possessed of the carefully maintained incuriosity of someone who had worked for powerful people long enough to understand that questions were a luxury she could not afford. She showed Violet her rooms, told her meals were at 7 and 1, and disappeared into the lower floors with the silent competence of a person who intended to be useful and invisible in equal measure. Kedrick came that evening, not socially. He walked into the sitting room with the focused, compacted energy of a man who had spent the day in motion and had arrived somewhere with a specific purpose that had nothing to do with courtesy. "Vane has been located," he said, before she could speak. Violet set down the book she had not been reading. "Where?" "A property in Southwark, rented under a false name 3 weeks ago. One of my people tracked the rental agent." He remained standing. The room was small enough that his presence filled it differently than his study had. Less territorial, more compressed, like a large animal in an unfamiliar space. "He has people with him. 4, possibly 5. Men he's used before, according to the information I've gathered." "He's not running anymore?" "No. He's been building, which means the realignment Charlotte identified was accurate. He moved you, got the information to you, waited to see how you played it, and when you didn't play it the way he wanted, he decided to stop being indirect." Kedrick's jaw set. "He sent a message this afternoon. To the House of Lords contact, Lord Pemberton's cousin, a man named Archie Crane. The message told Crane that the Ashcombe letters are in a solicitor's vault under Violet Ashcombe's name, and that I am positioning her as my primary instrument in the move against the coalition." Violet absorbed this. "He's telling them to come after me before the letters can be used. He's telling them that neutralizing you neutralizes the threat." The word neutralizing sat between them with its full clinical ugliness. "Crane will have communicated this to the other 4 families by tonight, which means by tomorrow morning, 5 of the most powerful families in England will have decided that a girl in a Bloomsbury townhouse is the single point of failure in their continued freedom." The fire in the grate worked steadily. Outside, the street was quiet, the ordinary, indifferent quiet of a city. Going about its evening without any awareness that somewhere in its geography, calculations were being made about whether a specific person should continue to exist. "You need to move the letters," Kedrick said. "I already have." He stopped. The stillness again. The recalibrating stillness. "When?" "This afternoon, while you were locating Vane." She held his eyes. "I had Charlotte's father's solicitor transfer the documentation to a secondary arrangement. The vault in his office now contains a letter from me confirming the arrangement and providing 3 references to 3 different locations, none of which are the actual location, each of which would require significant effort to investigate and eliminate." She paused. "If someone breaks into the vault, they find a map that goes nowhere. If someone breaks into me, I can give them 3 false trails and buy enough time for the real documents to surface through a separate channel I've already arranged." The silence that followed this was a different quality from the others. Not the silence of a man recalibrating. The silence of a man encountering, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, the experience of having been genuinely outpaced by someone he had been attempting to protect. "You arranged a separate channel," Kedrick said. "A journalist. Someone who has been investigating the Liverpool fire for 2 years independently, and who would know exactly what to do with documentary evidence if it arrived from an anonymous source." She kept her voice level. "If anything happens to me, the letters reach him within 48 hours. Which means the story breaks regardless. Which means the coalition has no incentive to move against me because I'm already a dead switch." Kedrick looked at her. The firelight made the hard planes of his face more severe, the shadows deeper. He was a man who had spent 20 years as the most feared force in his world, who had destroyed families, broken alliances, collapsed fortunes with the cold efficiency of someone for whom power was not ambition, but simply the medium he existed in. And he was standing in a small Bloomsbury sitting room, looking at a 19-year-old girl who had, in less than 72 hours, constructed a more effective defensive architecture than anything he had built in 4 years of pursuing Thomas Vane. "You did all of this today?" he said. "I had time." "You had a few hours." "I've been thinking about it for 4 years," Violet said. "I just didn't know what I was thinking about." Something moved through his expression that she had not seen before. Something that arrived without the usual delay, without the controlled transit through layers of defense and calculation. Raw and immediate and gone almost as quickly as it came, like a flame through paper. She filed it in the same place she filed all the small moments she was collecting about this man. The raised glass he never drank from, the Sunday dinner he had used to draw Vane into the open, The word good spoken so quietly at the bottom of his staircase that only she had heard it. "They'll move tonight," Kedrick said, and the moment was over, and the operational man was back. "Not tomorrow, tonight." Crane is impulsive. The Hargrove family has been impulsive since the father. When frightened people make group decisions, they move fast and they move badly. He crossed to the window and looked down at the dark street. "I'm putting men on the building." "How many do you have?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer you're getting." He turned from the window. "I need you to stay in this building tonight, not from the upper floors, not on the street, inside." "And you?" "I'm going to Southwark." The room's temperature seemed to drop 2 degrees. Violet stood up. "You're going directly to Vane." "I'm ending this tonight. With 4 or 5 men protecting him. With more than 4 or 5 on my side." "That's not—" She stopped, looked at him, looked at the set of his jaw, the controlled stillness that had always communicated to her. Not the absence of feeling, but the vast architectural management of it, and she understood something that hit her with more physical force than she expected. Not the tactical concern, though the tactical concern was real and specific. Something else. Something that arrived below the level of strategic thinking, in the place where the body keeps its truest assessments. "You're going because you need to be the one who finishes it," she said. "Not because you have to be there operationally, because you need it to be you." Kedrick held her gaze. Didn't confirm, didn't deny. The confirmation and the denial were equally visible in his silence. 4 years is a long time to carry something, Violet said. "Yes. And tonight, regardless of what I've arranged, regardless of the journalist and the dead switch and every other protection in place, tonight you're going to walk into a building in Southwark because Thomas Vane took something from you, and you will not close this chapter any other way. You're not going to talk me out of it. I know." She crossed the room and stopped 2 feet from him. The geometry of the ballroom reversed. The distance collapsed, not by his advance, but by hers. "I'm not trying to. I'm telling you I understand it, because my father was gentle and honest, and it destroyed him. And I have spent 4 years being careful and strategic and absorbing every blow, and I am tired of it in a way I cannot fully describe." She looked up at his face, the iron eyes, the hard jaw, the accumulated weight of a man who had made his accommodation with the worst of himself and lived inside it. "I want to be in that room when you find him." "No." Kedrick. "No." Flat. Final. The word of a man who had made one decision entirely free of strategy. "Not because I don't think you're capable. Not because I'm protecting you from something you can't handle. Because if something goes wrong in that building tonight, I need to know where you are. I need that to be a fixed point." He paused. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I need one fixed point." Violet looked at him for a long time. "Come back," she said. He left without another word. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the brief exchange with someone at the door, low voices, operational shorthand, and then the street door, and then nothing. She sat back down, did not pick up the book. The fire worked on, indifferent and steady, and the house was very quiet around her, and she thought about fixed points and what it cost a man who controlled everything to admit he needed one. The night deepened. Mrs. Bowen brought tea at 9 without being asked, and departed with the same careful invisibility as before. Violet heard movement outside, the slight sounds of men positioning themselves that were designed to be inaudible to ordinary ears, but that she, sitting in the contained silence of a room where she had nothing to do but listen, could detect if she concentrated. The street outside had the quality of a held breath. The ordinary evening noise of Bloomsbury filtered through the walls, and underneath it, something tighter. At 10:30, the window at the end of the hall exploded inward. Not glass-breaking quiet, a full concussive impact. Wood, glass, frame, the whole architecture of the window disintegrating under something large and deliberate. Violet was on her feet before the sound had finished resolving. She heard shouting from the street. Kedrick's men, she recognized the urgency of it. And then heavy footsteps on the stairs moving up, not down, which meant they had come through the back. She had 3 seconds. She used them. The iron candlestick was still on the table. She picked it up, moved to the wall beside the sitting room door rather than away from it, because the door was where the footsteps were going to come through, and the wall beside it was the only place in the room that was not a clear sightline from the threshold. She pressed her back against the plaster and held the candlestick in both hands, and made herself breathe. 2 counts in, 2 counts out, the way her father had taught her to do mathematics when she was afraid, because the mechanism of counting held the panic at the perimeter where it could not interfere with function. The door opened. The man who came through it was not Vane. He was large, one of the 4 or 5 hired muscle, a face built for intimidation rather than thought. He was looking at the center of the room where a person would logically be standing, and in the half-second it took his eyes to find the empty space and begin the adjustment. Violet brought the candlestick across the side of his head with every ounce of force her body contained. The sound was terrible. He went sideways into the doorframe and did not go down immediately, which told her she had hit skull rather than temple, and that she had not done it right. And then she hit him again, lower, harder, and he went down and stayed down. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this the way she noticed the cold, as information, not as feeling. The shaking was adrenaline, and she could not afford to give it her attention. She stepped over the man in the doorway and moved into the hall. 2 more on the stairs. They had heard the fall. They were looking up at her, one already moving, one a step behind. And the one moving had something in his hand that was not a candlestick. From below, the street door crashed open. A voice she recognized. "Stand down. Every man in this building, stand down." Not Kadrick's voice. His second, a man named Garrett, she had heard referenced once, spoken about in the specific shorthand reserved for people whose competence has been proven enough times to stop requiring description. The voice had the cast-iron authority of someone who meant it in the way that made people believe being tested was not worth the cost. The man on the stairs with something in his hand made a calculation. The calculation took less than 2 seconds. He lowered his hand. Violet stood at the top of the stairs with blood on her knuckles, and the candlestick still raised, and her breathing doing things she was refusing to let become panic, and below her the hallway filled with Kadrick's people, controlled, professional, operating with the efficient silence of men who had done this kind of work before. And the 2 men on the stairs were pushed against the wall and held there with a thoroughness that made further calculation pointless. Garrett looked up at her from the base of the stairs. He was 40-ish, compact, with a face that gave nothing away. His eyes moved to the man visible in the doorway behind her, down and not moving, and then back to her face. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, are you injured?" "No?" Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "What's happening in Southwark?" Garrett's expression shifted by a fraction. Not hesitation, a controlled delivery of information he had already decided how to frame. His Grace located Vane at the property. "The operation is—" A sound from outside, sharp, distant, the particular compressed violence of something that was not the ordinary noise of the London night. "Garrett!" Violet came down the stairs, past the 2 men held against the wall, past the controlled machinery of Kadrick's people, managing the remnants of an attack that had failed. "What is happening in Southwark right now?" Garrett looked at her with the expression of a man who had been given clear instructions about what to tell her and was renegotiating with those instructions in real time. "There were more than 5, he said, at the property. Vane had additional men. The count was wrong. The sitting room fire was still burning upstairs. Violet could feel its warmth at her back. She could feel her pulse in the cut on her knuckles, in her throat, in the specific urgent place behind her sternum where the body sends its most important communications. "How many more?" she said. "We don't know yet. Is he—" She stopped. Rebuilt the question. "Does he need the room cleared here before he can—" "I've already sent word," Garrett said. "But Miss Ashcombe, take me there." "My instructions are explicit. Your instructions were given before 3 men came through my window." She held his gaze with the same quality of directness she had used on Kadrick, on Hargrove, on Thomas Vane, in a dark hallway, with a candlestick raised. The quality of someone who has stopped measuring themselves against the people in the room and started simply occupying the same space. "The situation has changed. I am part of this operation whether or not I was meant to be. And right now the man who runs it is in a building in Southwark with more enemies than anyone counted, and I have information about Vane that Kadrick does not." Garrett's jaw moved. "What information?" "The kind I'll tell him directly." She looked at the street door, still open behind the men filling the hallway. The London night pressed in through it, cold, indifferent, smelling of coal smoke and frost. "Get me a carriage, right now." Garrett looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned to the nearest man and said something in a voice pitched too low for her to catch, and the man moved, and Violet understood that she had just done the thing Kadrick had told her not to do. She had become a variable in motion. The carriage moved fast through streets that had emptied in the way that London streets empty late at night. Not completely, never completely, but with enough absence that speed was possible. Violet sat with the iron candlestick still in her hand because she had not consciously put it down, and she thought about what she had told Garrett, information about Vane that Cadric does not have. It was true. Not the strategic architecture of the letters, not the documentary evidence, something more fundamental. Something Vane had given her Thursday night in the specific, unguarded exhaustion of a man who had been running alone for 4 years and had briefly, fatally, let the loneliness of it show. He had told her why he had come back. Not the letters, not the plan, the reason underneath those. He had told her there was a child, a daughter, 8 years old, living with her mother in Edinburgh under a false name. A daughter Vane had been sending money to through the same shell structures he had used to hide his own survival. A daughter whose continued safety, in Vane's assessment, required the total and permanent neutralization of Cadric Blackthorne. Because as long as Blackthorne lived and looked for him, the thread that led from Blackthorne to Vane led eventually to the girl in Edinburgh. Violet had not told this to Cadric. She had told him everything else. She had kept this one thing, because she understood, with the cold clarity that 4 years of systematic loss had built into her bone structure, that a man fighting to protect a child is not fighting the same war as a man fighting for revenge. They are not the same enemy. They do not respond to the same pressure. And in the building in Southwark, right now, with a miscounted number of additional men and an operation that had not gone as planned, Cadric Blackthorne was facing Thomas Vane without knowing what was actually driving the man he was hunting. The carriage stopped. Garrett opened the door before she could reach the handle. The building was a warehouse at the edge of the river, large, dark, 3 stories of London stock brick, with the river smell coming off the water behind it, and every window black. Around it, the controlled deployment of Cadric's people, positions held, perimeter established, the professional stillness of men waiting on a signal. 2 of them had wounds, visible in the way that fresh injuries are visible, even in the dark, by the quality of attention the body gives them. More than 5. The count was wrong. Garrett's hand on her arm, not gripping, directing. Here, you stay at this position. Where is he? Inside, 3rd floor. The situation is... He stopped. A sound from above, something that was not a gunshot, but carried the same violence, the same compressed finality. Glass. Something heavy. The particular acoustic signature of a large space where something had just gone very wrong. Violet did not make a decision. Her body made it for her. She was at the door before Garrett could complete his objection, and through it before the 2 men flanking the entrance could fully process what was happening, and inside the building the darkness was absolute and smelled of river water and old wood and something sharper and more recent that she did not let herself name. The stairs. Her feet found them by feel, by the logic of industrial buildings, by the animal navigation of a person moving towards something they cannot afford to approach slowly. 2nd floor. 3rd floor. A door at the end of a corridor lit by a single lamp knocked on its side, throwing a parallelogram of yellow light across a floor that told her immediately and without ambiguity that the count had indeed been wrong. She did not stop at the door. She pushed it open. The room was large, river-facing, with the shattered remnants of a window open to the cold night air. 3 men down. Cadric's. And the knowledge of it landed like a physical blow, a weight added to the air. 2 more of Vane's people against the far wall, held there by the last of Cadric's operational team. And in the center of the room, in the yellow half-light, Cadric Blackthorne stood over Thomas Vane with a face that Violet had not yet seen him wear, stripped of every layer of control, every social architecture, every instrument of the powerful man who had managed his emotions into structural components. What was left was older and rawer and more human. The face of a man who had been running on 4 years of cold, precise fury and had finally arrived at the terminus of it and found, at the end of all that distance, that he did not know what came next. Vane was on the floor, not unconscious, present and aware, looking up at Cadric with the specific look of a man who has run out of moves and has found, in that exhaustion, a terrible stillness. There was blood on his face. There was blood on Cadric's hands. Neither of them had heard her come in. "Cadric," Violet said. He turned, and the look on his face when he saw her, The specific, involuntary shift that moved across it at the sight of her standing in the doorway told her something she would need a long time to fully understand. The fixed point. He had said he needed one fixed point. She had not stayed fixed. "I told you," he started. "He has a daughter," Violet said. 8 years old, in Edinburgh. She's why he came back. She's why he needs you destroyed. Not revenge, not money. She's the fixed point. She crossed the room, not looking at Vane, keeping her eyes on Cadrick's face and the thing moving behind it. "If you kill him tonight, she disappears. The money stops. The only person who knows where she is and how she's hidden goes with him, and an 8-year-old girl in Edinburgh loses the last thing she has." She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that she could see the full damage of tonight in the lines of his face, in the blood on his hands, in the shallow, controlled pace of his breathing. "That is not what you are." Kedrick looked at her. Then he looked at Vane on the floor. Thomas Vane looked up at Violet with an expression she had not expected. Not gratitude, something more complicated than gratitude, something that had not yet been named by the face of a man who had spent 4 years hardening himself against exactly this kind of unexpected mercy. "The girl's name," Cadrick said. His voice was rough, raw in a way she had not heard from him before. The edge of a man who had been running at full capacity for too long and was feeling, for the first time, the cost. "You're going to give it to me. Her location, the financial arrangements, all of it." Vane's eyes moved between them. The calculation was visible. The last calculation of a man who had run out of alternatives and was doing the math on whether the thing being offered was real. "And then," Kedrick said, and the word carried the weight of everything he had built toward for 4 years. Everything he had sacrificed to patience and precision and the cold, enduring intention of a man who had been wronged and had promised himself the wrongdoing would not go unanswered. "And then you're going to tell me every name, every transaction, every member of that coalition, everything." His jaw set. The iron in his eyes at full force, undiluted, leveled at the man on the floor with the totality of something that had been accumulating for a very long time. Because the alternative is not death. The alternative is everything else. The room held its breath. Outside, the river moved past with the indifferent continuity of water that had been moving through this city for centuries before any of them arrived, and would continue long after. The lamp on its side kept throwing its parallelogram of light across the floor. Thomas Vane looked up at Cadrick Blackthorne and at Violet Ashcombe standing beside him, and something in his face completed a journey that had apparently been in progress for longer than tonight. He opened his mouth, and from the doorway behind Violet, a voice she had not heard in 4 years said her name. Not a shout. Quiet. The specific quiet of a person who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has arrived at it with patience she did not know they possessed. She turned. Lord Archie Crane stood in the doorway with 6 men behind him and a document in his hand, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had looked at an impossible situation and found, in his fear, a solution that was worse than the problem. "Miss Ashcombe," Crane said, "I believe you have something that belongs to several families who would prefer to continue existing, and I believe the Duke of Blackthorne is in no position, at this particular moment, to prevent us from taking it." The room processed Crane's arrival in the space of a single collective breath. 6 men in the door, the document in his hand, thick, official-looking, the kind of paper that powerful men carried when they wanted the appearance of legitimacy to stand in for the actual thing. And behind Violet, the specific quality of stillness that told her Cadrick had made the same rapid inventory she had. Wounded men, depleted numbers, a room that had already been fought through once tonight and could not absorb a second fight at the same scale. She did not turn back to look at him. She kept her eyes on Crane. Lord Archie Crane was 55 and looked like a man who had spent his entire life making decisions that other people paid for. The kind of face that belonged to appointed positions and inherited committees, soft at the edges in the way that faces go soft when they have never been pressed against genuine consequence. But tonight, there was something different in it. The fear underneath was visible, not the theatrical concern of a politician performing gravity, but the real biological fear of a man who had done the math and understood that the numbers were closing in. Frightened men with resources were, in Violet's experience, the most dangerous calculation available. "The document," Crane said, holding it up with the deliberate display of someone who wants the object seen. "Signed by 3 lords, 2 magistrates, and the Solicitor General." It authorizes the immediate seizure of any materials held in connection with the fabricated conspiracy being assembled against 5 lawful families of the English aristocracy. He let that land, including materials held under the name Ashcombe. That document, Violet said, was assembled in less than 4 days by men who were told their freedom was at risk, which means it was assembled in a panic and signed by people who didn't read it carefully. She held Crane's gaze across the broken room with the candlestick still in her hand, and blood dried on her knuckles and nothing on her face that she had not chosen to put there. Which means it will not survive a challenge, and I will challenge it. You are 19 years old with no legal standing, no money, and no— She has me, Kedrick's voice from behind her. The room shifted again. Violet did not look, did not need to. She felt him move up beside her, felt the specific weight of his presence in the air, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure. And she knew from the quality of the silence that followed that Crane's 6 men had just performed the same rapid reassessment that every room full of people performed when Kedrick Blackthorne reminded them of what he was. Even wounded. Even in a room that smelled of blood and river water, with 3 of his people down and his hands not clean. The man was what he was in the way that geography is what it is. Not a performance, not a construction, but a fundamental condition of the environment. Crane, Kedrick said. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. You came here tonight because you were frightened. I understand that. But you have made a strategic error that I'm going to give you exactly 1 opportunity to correct. Crane's jaw tightened. I have 6. You have 6 men who are looking at me and making the same calculation you should be making. Kedrick took 1 step forward. The step of a man who understands that territory is not claimed by aggression, but by the willingness to occupy space that others have already conceded. The document you're holding is fraudulent. I have 3 solicitors who will confirm that within the hour. The signatures on it represent men who signed under duress or under false pretense, and every one of them will say so when the alternative is being named as co-conspirators in the Liverpool fire. He paused. You know about the Liverpool fire, Crane. Your name is not in the letters, but your cousin's is. And if you walk out of this building right now and you do not bring those 6 men back, I will forget your cousin's name was ever in my possession. The silence was enormous. 14 people in a broken room above a river, and the only sound was the water moving outside and the lamp on its side burning down. Crane looked at Kedrick, looked at Violet, looked at the document in his own hand as though he was seeing it clearly for the first time and finding it somewhat less substantial than he had believed when he picked it up. Then he looked at the men behind him, and they looked at him. And the specific quality of that mutual gaze communicated, without a word exchanged, everything that needed to be understood about the relative costs of what they had walked into. Crane folded the document, put it inside his coat, turned and walked out. His 6 men followed. The footsteps on the stairs, the street door. The night swallowing them without ceremony or drama, the way the night swallows everything that loses its nerve. The room breathed. Violet felt the adrenaline leave her body in one long, silent wave, not dramatically, not with trembling or collapse, but with the quiet, thorough depletion of a machine that has been running above its rated capacity and has finally been permitted to return to standard operation. She was very tired. The cut on her hand throbbed with the patient, specific persistence of injuries that have been ignored long enough to develop opinions about it. Behind her, Thomas Vane had not moved from the floor. She turned. Kedrick was looking at Vane with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Not the raw, stripped fury of before, not the controlled operational mask of earlier. Something in between those states, or perhaps something that existed outside that spectrum entirely. The look of a man standing on the far side of a wall he has been climbing for 4 years, finding the view neither as satisfying nor as simple as the climbing had promised. This was the thing that power never advertised about itself. The arrival was never the vindication. The victory always contained, somewhere in its architecture, the quiet and devastating question of what came next. The girl's name, Kedrick said to Vane. His voice was level, emptied of performance. Vane looked up at him for a long moment. Then he said, Margaret. She goes by Meg. Her mother's name is Sarah Hollis, and they live on Thornfield Street in Edinburgh under the name Hollis. He stopped. His throat moved. She has her mother's coloring, brown hair. She likes mathematics. The detail was unexpected. It landed in the room with a weight entirely disproportionate to its size. Not the strategic information, not the location or the name, but that last piece. She likes mathematics. The offering of a man laying down the one thing he had been carrying that had nothing to do with plans or documents or survival. The human core of it, finally visible. Kedrick nodded. Once. She'll be provided for. The arrangement continues under a different name. He paused. You will not contact her directly. You will not return to England. If you surface again in any context that connects to my operations, my business, or anyone associated with me, the arrangement ends. Vane said nothing. The terms were not negotiable, and he knew it. He was past the point of negotiating. He was at the point of receiving what was being given, which was more than he had earned and less than he had hoped for. And in the economy of a man who had lost everything except one thing, it was enough. Garrett appeared in the doorway. Violet had not seen him arrive. He had the quality of appearing in situations when they had reached the point of needing managing, and he managed them with the same professional invisibility as Mrs. Bowen provided tea. Carriage is outside, Garrett said to Kedrick. Then to Violet, Miss Ashcombe, you should let someone look at that hand. She looked down at her hand. The cut was longer than she had realized. The iron candlestick, still in her grip, was dark along one edge. She set it down on a crate beside her. Let it go. The weight of it leaving her hand felt significant in a way she could not entirely explain. They left the building by the river door. The night outside was full cold, the water black and moving, the far bank. A scatter of lights that looked like nothing so much as a reflection of the sky on an overcast night, dim, scattered, indifferent to the distance between them. Kedrick walked beside her across the narrow strip of ground between the building and the water, and did not take her arm or guide her or perform any of the social choreography of a man assisting a woman. He simply walked beside her, and the walking was its own statement in a language she had spent 4 months learning to read. The carriage was there. Garrett's people moved around them with quiet efficiency, managing the remnants of the night. The men who needed transportation, the situation that needed the particular kind of reporting that made incidents disappear from public record. Inside the carriage, in the darkness and warmth, Violet pressed her back against the seat and looked at the ceiling and felt, fully and without management, the complete architecture of the past 4 months arrive in her body all at once. The winter ball, the borrowed dress, the green dress, the dinner, the letters. Vane in the hallway, the dead switch, the window exploding inward, the candlestick. Crane's face when he understood the calculation was wrong. Beside her, Kedrick sat in silence. Not the silence of absence, the silence of a man who had arrived somewhere and was sitting with the view. Your hand, he said, eventually. It's fine. It's not fine. It will be. He turned to look at her in the dark of the carriage. She could not see his expression clearly, only the shape of his face, the line of his jaw, the quality of attention that she had come to recognize as distinctly his, the cataloging gaze that had by now mapped enough of her to have moved past inventory into something more continuous. You came to the building, he said. Yes. I told you to stay. You told me you needed a fixed point. She turned her head and looked at him. I decided the fixed point could move. A silence. The carriage moved through London streets that were nearly empty at this hour. The city in its brief, nocturnal privacy, the gaslights burning for no one in particular, the cold pressing against the windows with the patient insistence of winter. Vane was going to tell you everything, Violet said. Before Crane arrived, you had him. You didn't need me to give you the leverage. You had it. I know. Then the information about the daughter changed what I did with the leverage. He said it directly, without the defensive layering that other men used to disguise the moments when they had been affected by something. Yes, Violet thought about that, about the specific weight of information given at the right moment. Her father had believed in the power of truth, had believed it so completely and so naively that he had never developed adequate defenses against people who didn't share the belief. She had spent 4 years deciding that truth was a tool like any other, to be deployed or withheld according to circumstance. And tonight she had deployed it not strategically, but because it was true, and because the man standing over Thomas Vane with 4 years of cold rage in his hands had deserved to know the full picture before he decided what to do with it. And what he had done with it was not what she would have predicted 4 months ago, not what anyone who knew Kedrick Blackthorne by reputation would have predicted. He had given Vane terms, had preserved the daughter's arrangement, had offered Crane an exit. had, in the space of 20 minutes, made 3 decisions that contained something beyond the operational calculus of a man protecting his interests. She did not say this. She did not need to say it. He knew what he had done, and so did she, and the acknowledgement of it existed between them already, in the quality of the silence, in the fact that they were sitting in this carriage in the same direction. The townhouse in Bloomsbury appeared through the window. The street had been cleaned of Crane's people with characteristic efficiency. No sign of the evening's violence, the ordinary face of London restored like a stage set between scenes. Inside, Mrs. Bowen materialized from the lower floors with warm water and clean cloth, and the expression of a woman who had seen worse and survived it by treating wounds rather than discussing them. She cleaned the cut on Violet's hand with brisk, capable kindness, and wrapped it, and departed again without a word. Kedrick sat across the sitting room and watched this and said nothing. The fire had been rebuilt during their absence, another service performed by invisible, competent people, and the light it threw was warmer and less dramatic than the lamp on its side in the warehouse, which was a relief Violet felt more deeply than she expected. "The letters," she said. "I'll authorize the release to your solicitor tomorrow morning. Full transfer of all documentation to your legal team." "Keep them," Kedrick said. She looked at him. "I'm sorry." "Keep them. Under your name. The arrangement you built is better than anything I would have constructed. A dead switch. A journalist. A vault that requires your presence. That's not a resource you hand over. That's a position." He met her eyes. "You don't give up your positions." Violet looked at him across the firelit room and thought about the word position, and the distance it had traveled in 4 months, from the cold transactional assessment she had made of it in the carriage after the winter ball, to whatever it meant now, in this room, in this specific configuration of 2 people who had spent 4 months making each other's plans more complicated. "Charlotte is going to have opinions about tonight," Violet said. "Charlotte Pemberton has opinions about everything. She's usually right. She's usually cautious." A pause. Something shifted at the corners of his eyes. "There's a difference." Violet felt the laugh arrive before she could decide whether to let it out. Small, brief, entirely genuine, the kind that comes from the body rather than the performance of feeling. It surprised her. It appeared to surprise him. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a room he thought he knew has a window he had not seen before. "Go to sleep," he said. His voice was lower. The operational edge gone from it. "It's past 2 in the morning, and you hit a man with a candlestick, and your hand is wrapped in bandage, and you should sleep. Are you going?" The question arrived before she had fully formed the intention to ask it. It sat between them with more weight than its 4 words suggested, and they both felt it, and neither of them looked away. "No," he said. She nodded, rose, crossed to the doorway, stopped without quite knowing why, and turned back and looked at him sitting in the chair by the fire. The Duke of half of England's trade, the most feared man in London, sitting in a small Bloomsbury sitting room with blood still dried on his hands that Mrs. Bowen had not gotten to yet, looking at the fire with an expression she had never seen on a powerful person's face before. He looked tired, not physically, or not only physically. The deep structural tiredness of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time, and has set it down, and is feeling, for the first time, the specific weight of the absence where the burden used to be. The body's confused, quiet grief at being relieved of its load. She understood it. She was feeling it too, in the wrapped hand and the aching arms, and the place behind her sternum where the letter had been pressed for months, now gone, transferred, properly placed. "Kedrick," she said. He looked up. "You let him go," she said. Not as an accusation, not as a question, as the naming of a thing she wanted him to hear acknowledged. "After 4 years. You had him, and you let him go." He held her gaze. The fire worked between them. "I let him live," he said. "That's not the same as letting him go." "No," she said. "It's harder." Something moved through his face that she was not supposed to see, and that she saw anyway. The brief, unguarded truth of a man who had spent 20 years convincing himself that hardness was a permanent condition rather than a choice made so many times it had calcified into character. The fracture line in that conviction, visible for exactly 1 second before the architecture reasserted itself. "Sleep," he said. She went. The weeks that followed had the quality of weather changing. Not sudden, not dramatic, but cumulative and total. The kind of change that you only recognize in full when you look back from the other side of it and realize that the landscape is no longer the same. The coalition collapsed with the systematic thoroughness of a structure that had been weight-bearing in all the wrong places. Lord Archie Crane resigned his committee positions in February, citing ill health. The polite London formulation for a man who has been offered a specific choice and has made the less destructive one. The Hargrove family's shipping interests were absorbed through legal mechanisms that left Sebastian Hargrove with his title and approximately 1/6 of his previous holdings, which was, in the general assessment of those who knew the specifics, significantly more than he deserved. 3 other families negotiated settlements through intermediaries. The magistrate retired. The Liverpool fire story broke in March, not through the journalist Violet had identified as the dead switch, through a parliamentary inquiry that had apparently been quietly building for 2 years and found, delivered to its lead investigator through an anonymous and unimpeachable source, exactly the documentation it needed. 14 dock workers' families received compensation. The inquiry named names. The names included Hargrove Sr., posthumously, and 2 corporate entities that traced back through careful reconstruction to the shell structures Thomas Vane had operated. Vane himself was not named. He was, officially, still dead. In Edinburgh, a woman named Sarah Hollis continued to receive a quarterly payment from a legal instrument that named no benefactor and required no acknowledgement. Her daughter Meg, who liked mathematics, was enrolled in a good school that year. Violet learned this from Garrett, who told her the way he told her most things, without editorializing, as a statement of verified fact, and then moved on to the next item of business, as though the human weight of it was self-evident and did not require elaboration. She was in Keodrick's study when he told her. This had become a common location, not through explicit arrangement, but through the accumulated logic of 2 people who kept ending up in the same place. She had moved from the Bloomsbury townhouse in February, when the coalition's dissolution made the strategic reasons for the arrangement less urgent than the practical reasons for a different one. The conversation about what the different arrangement meant had been, in the way of conversations between people who communicate as much through action as through language, not entirely verbal. Charlotte had opinions. Violet let her have them. Some of them were right. It was a Tuesday in April when Keodrick found her in the East Library at Blackthorn Manor, with the Ashcombe letters spread across the table. Not the originals, which remained in the vault, but the copies she had made and annotated over months of reading them against the unfolding legal record. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table and looked at her. "You're building a timeline," he said. "I'm finishing one. The inquiry covered most of it. There are 3 gaps that the public record doesn't close." She looked up. "My father's name is in all 3 gaps. Not as a participant, as a victim. But he's in them, and the way he's referenced implies involvement he didn't have. The inquiry's findings don't impute him. The inquiry's findings don't clear him either, which means the people who knew him, the people who remember the Ashcombe name, have a version of events that still leaves a question." She looked down at the papers, the ink on them, her father's handwriting on the copies, careful and meticulous and completely oblivious to the damage being done around it. "I want to submit the timeline to the inquiry, with a formal statement. I want the record corrected." Keodrick crossed the room and looked at the papers over her shoulder. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the particular gravity of his proximity that she had stopped trying to be unaffected by somewhere around February. He looked at the timeline with the same focused, specific attention he gave everything, reading it not just as text, but as architecture, mapping the structural logic of what she had built. "It's complete," he said. "The 3 gaps need sourcing. I have the sourcing. I've had it for 2 years. A pause. "I didn't use it because it clarifies your father's position and implicates 2 people who were, at the time, still useful to me." Violet looked up at him. "Are they still useful to you?" she said. "No." "Then give me the sourcing." He looked at her for a moment. The iron eyes, the hard face. The man who had told her once that mercy was a word from a language no one spoke anymore, and who had let Thomas Vane live, and who was now standing in a library offering her the documents that would restore her father's name with the directness of someone who has simplified their accounting considerably. "It's already on the desk in my study," he said. "I put it there this morning." Violet looked at him. He held her gaze with the undefended steadiness of someone who has stopped requiring the defense. "You put it there this morning," she said. "I was going to bring it to you." You were waiting for me to ask. I was waiting to see if you would ask or just go find it yourself. Which would you have preferred? The ghost of the expression she had first seen on his face at the bottom of his staircase moved through his features. The thing that was not a smile, but existed in the same neighborhood. Closer, now, less remote. I don't prefer one, he said. I was curious which one you'd choose. She gathered the papers from the table, set them in order with the careful precision of someone who has learned to take her time with things that matter, and not to mistake speed for efficiency. Then she stood and looked at the man across the table, this ruthless, controlled, deeply human person who had entered her life as a threat and had become something she did not have a clean word for, because the words available were either too small or too large, and none of them captured the specific truth of what stood between them. Kedrick, she said. Violet. My father spent his whole life believing the world would reward honest dealing. She paused. Let the full weight of what she was about to say settle into place before she released it. He was wrong about the world, but he wasn't wrong about the principle. The principle just requires better implementation than he gave it. Kedrick looked at her across the table. The April light came through the library windows. Thin still, winter not fully relinquished, but present in a way that February had not permitted. The kind of light that suggests the argument for warmth is not yet won, but is being made. Is that what you've been doing? He said, implementing the principle. I've been figuring out what I believe, she said, under pressure, which is the only way you ever really find out. He came around the table, stopped in front of her the way he had stopped in front of her at the bottom of his staircase in December. Not the aggressive geometry of Hargrove, not the social performance of the aristocratic world, but the movement of a man who has decided something and is completing the decision with the same directness he brought to everything else. The inquiry submission, he said. When you send it, your name goes on it. My name was always going on it. Ashcombe, he said. Your full name, the family name. Not a footnote, not a witness statement. The primary submission. That's what I intended. Good. He held her gaze. Because in 6 months I intend to have your name be something that requires a longer sentence to say. And I would prefer that sentence to begin with something that isn't apologetic. Violet looked at him. The full proposal was implicit in the statement, and they both knew it, and neither of them required it to be made more explicit because some things communicated more precisely in the architecture of what was not said. You understand, she said carefully, that becoming a duchess does not change anything fundamental about who I am or how I operate. I'm counting on it. You understand that I will continue to make decisions without consulting you when speed or necessity requires it. I'm aware. I've seen the results. And you understand that the letters stay in my name. The letters, he said, will stay in your name until the day you decide they don't need to exist anymore. That decision is also yours. Violet nodded, looking down at the papers in her hands. Her father's handwriting on the copies, meticulous, trusting, the written record of a man who believed that keeping accurate accounts was its own form of integrity, who had never imagined that those accounts would survive him and travel this far, and ultimately do the work he had not been alive to do himself. She thought about what it cost to restore a name. Not money. Money was the surface measurement of things that went much deeper. What it actually cost was the willingness to keep going after the thing that destroyed you, not with rage, not with vengeance, but with the patient, unspectacular insistence of someone who has decided that the record matters and is going to correct it regardless of how long it takes. Her father would not have called that bravery. He would have called it responsibility. He would have been right. She set the papers down, looked at Kedrick, at the man who had entered her life as the embodiment of everything her father's world had failed against, and who had become, through the strange and ungraceful machinery of genuine circumstance, something her father's world had not prepared her for at all. I'll need the morning to finish the timeline, she said. You have the morning. And the afternoon for the formal statement. You have the afternoon. And tonight, she said, I want to eat a meal that was not cooked by someone trying to impress anyone. Something simple. In the kitchen. He looked at her for a moment. The hard face. The iron eyes. The man who had not smiled genuinely in longer than either of them could measure. Mrs. Hartley will consider that an insult, he said. Mrs. Hartley will survive it. He muttered a sound that was not quite a laugh and was entirely real and lasted less than 2 seconds. She stored it in the same place she kept all the small moments she had been collecting since December. The glass he never drank from. The word good spoken at the bottom of a staircase. the look on his face in a warehouse above the Thames when she had walked through a door she had been told to stay away from. The collection was extensive now. It had become, she realized, a kind of portrait, not the one hanging on the walls of the public rooms, the formal rendering of power, all dark pigment and deliberate severity. A different one, the portrait that accumulates not through sitting but through proximity, through being present in the unglamorous, unremarkable, persistent flow of actual days. She picked up the papers again, walked toward the study to retrieve the sourcing documents he had left there for her. Behind her, she heard him move back to the desk. The familiar sounds of a man returning to work, the orderly transaction of attention that was itself a kind of constancy. At the door she stopped, did not turn. Kedrick. "Still here," he said. The words landed with more weight than their plainness suggested. Still here. The two-word answer to the question she had not asked and did not need to. The statement of a man who had built his entire life around the management of uncertainty and had arrived, on the far side of all of it, at the understanding that some things did not require management, some things simply required showing up. Staying, being the fixed point that remained when everything else moved. She walked out into the corridor toward his study, and the April light fell through the windows of Blackthorn Manor at its particular angle. And somewhere in Edinburgh a girl named Meg was doing mathematics. And somewhere in the city a parliamentary inquiry was preparing to correct a record that had needed correcting for 4 years. And the letters sat in their vault under the name Ashcombe, which was not a name the city had finished with yet, not by a long way.